There's a moment in every person's life when they realize the people who were supposed to love them the most never loved them at all. For me, that moment came at Christmas dinner, surrounded by twinkling lights, the smell of roasted turkey, and a family that had been planning my destruction for years. My father looked me dead in the eyes and called me useless. He announced he was giving everything, the company, the inheritance, the future, to my younger sister, Melissa. And Melissa, she didn't even flinch. She just smirked and pulled out legal documents she'd already prepared. That's when I understood this wasn't a sudden decision. This was an execution they'd been planning while I smiled at family dinners and worked 18-hour days building their empire. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been preparing too. For 2 years, I watched. I waited. I built. The company they thought belonged to them. It ran on systems I created. The contracts keeping them afloat signed with technology I owned. The $86 million empire they were so eager to hand to my incompetent sister, I could collapse it with a single phone call. So when my father called me useless, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I smiled. And I walked out into the snow. 1 month later, I watched their entire world burn to the ground. But here's what nobody expected, not even me. The secrets that surfaced would be far more devastating than bankruptcy, and the person behind it all wasn't who anyone thought. This is my story. My name is Allison Diaz. I'm 32 years old, and for the past decade I've worked in technology consulting while quietly building something nobody in my family knows about. To them, I'm just the eldest daughter who never quite measured up, the one who fades into the background while others take center stage. But that night at that Christmas dinner, everything I had endured and everything I had planned was about to collide. The Diaz family Christmas dinner always looked like something from a magazine cover. Crystal glasses catching candlelight, a perfectly roasted turkey glistening in the center of the table, garlands of pine wrapped around the staircase banister. If you walked past our window on Christmas Eve, you would see what appeared to be a loving, successful family gathered to celebrate the season together. You would be looking at a lie. I had spent 14 hours preparing that meal. I woke at 5 in the morning to brine the turkey roasted vegetables until my back ached from standing, arranged the table settings 3 times until the napkins folded exactly the way my mother preferred. By the time the first guest arrived, my hands were raw from washing dishes, and my feet throbbed inside my shoes. Nobody said thank you. Nobody even noticed. When my younger sister Melissa walked through the front door at 6 o'clock 2 hours late, carrying nothing but her designer purse, my mother rushed to embrace her like she was a soldier returning from war. "Melissa, darling, you look absolutely stunning," my mother gushed, stroking Melissa's highlighted hair. "That dress is gorgeous. Is it new?" "Just a little something I picked up last week," Melissa said with a practiced smile. "You know how it is." I stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing my apron, a smear of cranberry sauce on my sleeve. My mother glanced at me for half a second before turning back to Melissa. "Come sit down, sweetheart. You must be exhausted from the drive." Exhausted from the drive. Melissa lived 40 minutes away. I had been cooking since before sunrise. But I said nothing. I had learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse. In the Diaz family, there were roles assigned at birth, and mine was to be invisible. We gathered around the table, my parents at each end, Melissa seated in the place of honor at my father's right hand, and me tucked into a corner where the chandelier's light barely reached. As I looked around at the faces of my family, I noticed the photographs hanging on the dining room wall. There was my parents' wedding portrait, Melissa's graduation picture, a family vacation from 15 years ago. But one face was conspicuously absent. My grandmother, my mother's mother. I was told she died when I was 5 years old. A car accident, my mother said, and she refused to discuss it further. There were no photographs of her anywhere in the house, no mention of her name, no visits to her grave. It was as if she had been erased from existence. I used to ask about her when I was young, but my mother's face would harden into stone, and I learned to stop asking. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if the story was even true. Dinner began pleasantly enough, or what passed for pleasant in our family. My father Richard dominated the conversation, as always, telling stories about business deals and golf games, while everyone nodded along. He was 67 years old, silver-haired, and still handsome in the way that wealthy men often are. He had built Diaz Corporation from nothing 40 years ago, and he never let anyone forget it. "You know what I was thinking about today?" my father said, reaching for his wine glass. "Remember when Allison was 12 and she tried to start a lemonade stand? I felt my stomach tighten. She set up this little table at the end of the driveway," he continued, already laughing. "Made signs and everything. And you know what happened? She forgot to add sugar to the lemonade. Not a single person bought a second cup." The table erupted in laughter. Melissa nearly choked on her wine. My mother covered her mouth, eyes sparkling with amusement. "That's our Allison," my father said, shaking his head. "Always trying, never quite getting there." I stared at my plate and said nothing. This was not new. My father had been telling humiliating stories about me at family gatherings for as long as I could remember, always framed as jokes, always landing at my expense. If I objected, I was being too sensitive. If I laughed along, I was agreeing that I deserved the mockery, so I simply endured as I always had. But tonight, something felt different. I looked at my mother, expecting to see her usual expression of mild amusement. Instead, I caught something else, a flicker of anticipation, quickly hidden. Her eyes kept darting to my father, as if she was waiting for something, as if she knew what was coming. The main course was cleared, and dessert was served, a chocolate cake I had baked from scratch, which everyone devoured without comment. Then my father tapped his knife against his glass, commanding silence. "I have an announcement to make," he said. The room went still. Even Melissa stopped fidgeting with her phone. "As you all know, I'm not getting any younger," my father began. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of Diaz Corporation, about legacy, about what happens when I'm gone." My heart began to beat faster. For one wild moment, I wondered if this was finally it, the moment my father would acknowledge everything I had done for the family, all the quiet contributions nobody recognized. "I've decided," my father continued, "to transfer all operational control and majority ownership of Diaz Corporation to Melissa effective January 1st. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Furthermore," my father said, turning to look directly at me, "I want to make something clear. Allison, you have never demonstrated the capability or the drive to be part of this company's future. To be frank, you've always been useless when it comes to business. This decision is final." Useless? The word hung in the air, sharp and absolute. I waited for someone to object, for my mother to say something, for Melissa to look uncomfortable at least. But my mother simply nodded, as if my father had announced the weather. And Melissa. Melissa reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of documents. "I had these prepared last week," she said smoothly, sliding the papers toward my father. "Legal transfer documents, everything's ready for your signature." Last week. They had planned this. All of them. The announcement, the timing, the documents, none of this was spontaneous. My family had been conspiring to humiliate me and remove me from the family legacy, and they had chosen Christmas dinner to do it. I looked around the table at the faces of the people who were supposed to love me. My father satisfied with his pronouncement. My mother carefully avoiding my eyes. My sister already flipping to the signature pages. And something inside me shifted. For 32 years I had cried when my family hurt me. I had apologized when I had done nothing wrong. I had shrunk myself smaller and smaller, hoping that if I just tried harder, worked longer, gave more, they would finally see my worth. But sitting at that table, watching my sister hand my father a pen, I realized the truth: they would never see my worth. They didn't want to. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't cry. I smiled. Because what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment for 2 years. And everything was about to change. The smile on my face felt foreign, like wearing someone else's expression. For 32 years, my response to family cruelty had been tears, silence, or desperate attempts to prove my worth. But something had fundamentally shifted in that moment. As I watched my father sign the documents that would transfer everything to Melissa, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the calm of someone who has finally stopped fighting against the current and decided to swim in an entirely different direction. My father finished signing with a flourish, clearly pleased with himself. He handed the pen to my mother, who added her signature as witness without hesitation. Melissa was already reaching for the documents, her manicured fingers trembling slightly with excitement. None of them looked at me. I had become invisible again, dismissed before the ink was even dry. That was their first mistake. I placed my napkin on the table with deliberate care, folding it exactly the way my mother had taught me when I was 6 years old. The small gesture caught Elena's attention, and she glanced up with mild curiosity. Then I stood. The movement was so unexpected that conversation stopped mid-sentence. In all my years of family dinners, I had never stood before being dismissed. I had never drawn attention to myself. I had never done anything that might be considered defiant. Without a word, I reached into my pocket and withdrew a set of keys. They were old and worn, the brass tarnished from years of use. I placed them on the table next to my water glass, and the soft clink of metal on wood seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. My father stared at the keys, his brow furrowing. "What are those?" I didn't answer. "Allison, I asked you a question. What are those keys?" Still I said nothing. I simply looked at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in my adult life. I saw a man who had never once told me he was proud of me. A man who had used my childhood failures as entertainment for decades. A man who had just called me useless in front of everyone I was supposed to call family. The silence stretched. My mother's face had gone pale, her social smile frozen in place. She recognized those keys even if my father didn't. They were the master keys to Diaz Corporation's main office, the ones I had been entrusted with 8 years ago when I briefly worked there, before my father decided I wasn't executive material. "Those are the office keys," my mother said quietly. "Richard, those are the company keys." My father's expression shifted from confusion to something harder. "What is this supposed to be, Allison? Some kind of dramatic gesture? You think leaving a set of keys on the table means anything?" I turned my gaze to my mother next. Elena Diaz, who had spent my entire childhood whispering criticisms disguised as concern, who had compared me unfavorably to Melissa at every opportunity, who had erased her own mother from existence and never explained why. Her eyes met mine, and for just a moment I saw something flicker. There was it guilt, fear I couldn't tell, and I realized I no longer cared. Finally, I looked at Melissa. My baby sister, 4 years younger, who had grown up believing she deserved everything simply because she existed, who had just accepted a company she had never worked to build, handed to her on a silver platter while I was declared worthless in front of everyone. Melissa mistook my silence for defeat. She leaned back in her chair with a smug expression, twirling her wine glass between her fingers. "This is pathetic," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What are you going to do, Allison Storm, off into the night? Go cry in your apartment. Face it without this family. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." The words were designed to wound, to make me crumble the way I always had before. I could see the anticipation in Melissa's eyes, the expectation that I would dissolve into tears and beg for forgiveness for another chance to prove myself. Instead, I looked directly at her and spoke for the first time since my father's announcement. "We'll see." 2 words, that was all. But the way I said them, calm, certain, almost amused, made Melissa's smug expression falter. For just a second, uncertainty crossed her face. She had never heard that tone from me before. None of them had. I turned and walked toward the front door, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard my father's chair scrape against the ground as he stood. "Allison, get back here. We're not finished discussing this." I kept walking. "Allison, I am talking to you." My hand closed around the doorknob, cold metal against warm skin. I opened the door and winter air rushed in carrying snowflakes that danced in the light from the foyer chandelier. "If you walk out that door," my father bellowed, "don't bother coming back. You're out of this family. Do you understand me? You're done." I stepped outside without looking back and closed the door softly behind me. There was no slam, no dramatic exit, just a quiet click that somehow felt more final than any display of anger could have been. The snow was falling heavily now, covering the driveway and the perfectly manicured lawn in a blanket of white. My car sat at the end of the circular drive, already dusted with powder. I walked toward it slowly, breathing in the sharp winter air, feeling the cold against my face like a baptism. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt clearer than I had in years. Once inside my car, I started the engine and let it warm for a moment. Through the window, I could see the dining room lights, the shadows of my family moving behind the curtains. Were they arguing? Celebrating? It didn't matter anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Allison, is everything all right? It's Christmas Eve." "David?" I said, my voice steady and calm. "Start the transition. It's time." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain? Once we begin, there's no going back." I looked one last time at the house where I had grown up, where I had spent 3 decades trying to earn love that was never available to me. The Christmas lights twinkled merrily along the roof line, beautiful and false. "I'm certain," I said. "Execute the plan exactly as we discussed." "Understood. I'll begin first thing tomorrow morning." I ended the call and put the car in drive. As I pulled away from my parents' house, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. The snow fell silently around me as I drove into the darkness, leaving behind everything I had once believed I needed. My family thought they had just discarded something worthless. They had no idea that I had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this night. And very soon they would discover that the daughter they called useless was about to become the most powerful person they had ever underestimated. The drive home took 45 minutes through the falling snow, but I barely noticed the time passing. My mind was elsewhere, drifting back through the years to the moment when everything had truly begun, not tonight at the Christmas table, but a decade ago in my father's office, when he shattered my last illusion about my place in this family. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a business degree and naive hopes that my father might finally see my potential. I had prepared a presentation about modernizing Diaz Corporation's operations, spent weeks researching and rehearsing, convinced that if I could just show him my ideas, he would recognize my value. My father listened for approximately 3 minutes before cutting me off. "Allison, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but let's be realistic," he said, not even bothering to look up from his computer screen. "You don't have the instincts for business. Some people are born with it, some aren't. Melissa has it. You don't. Why don't you find something more suited to your abilities? Teaching, maybe. Or nursing, something where you can help people without needing to make important decisions." I stood there holding my carefully prepared slides, watching my father dismiss my entire future with less consideration than he would give to choosing a restaurant for lunch. Melissa, who had just turned 18 and showed zero interest in anything beyond shopping, and parties apparently had natural business instincts. I, who had studied and prepared and dreamed, had nothing. That night I cried until my pillow was soaked through. Then I woke up the next morning and made a decision that would change everything. If my family would not give me a place in their company, I would build my own. I started with almost nothing. A laptop, a small apartment, and a burning determination to prove everyone wrong. I taught myself programming through online courses, staying up until 3 a.m. to master languages and systems that seemed impossibly complex at first. I studied data analysis, user experience design, and business operations. I read everything I could find about successful startups and failed ones, learning from both. My idea was simple but powerful. Create a software platform that could integrate and streamline operational systems for mid-sized businesses. Order management, inventory, tracking client databases, communication tools, all connected through one intuitive interface. Large corporations had expensive custom solutions for these problems. Small businesses used patchwork combinations of different programs that never quite worked together. The mid-market was underserved, and I saw the opportunity. For 2 years, I worked 18-hour days while surviving on savings and cheap noodles. I had no social life, no relationships, no vacations. My entire existence narrowed to the glowing screen of my laptop and the code I was painstakingly creating. There were nights when I wanted to quit, when the loneliness and exhaustion felt unbearable. But every time I considered giving up, I heard my father's voice telling me I lacked business instincts, and I found the strength to keep going. Then something unexpected happened. During my darkest period, when I was 3 months behind on rent, and considering whether I would have to crawl back to my family in defeat, I received an email from an investment firm I had never heard of. They had somehow learned about my project and wanted to meet. The meeting led to an investment offer that saved my company and changed my trajectory entirely. $200,000 in seed funding from an anonymous investor who requested only one condition: their identity must remain confidential. I was curious, of course, but I was also desperate. I signed the papers without demanding answers I wasn't entitled to receive. With that investment, I hired my first employee, then my second. Within a year, we had a working product and our first paying customers. Within 3 years, we had expanded to 50 employees and hundreds of clients across the country. Within 5 years, we had become one of the most reliable operational software providers in the mid-market space, trusted by businesses that ranged from regional restaurant chains to manufacturing companies to distribution networks. And then came the irony that still makes me smile whenever I think about it. 5 years ago, Diaz Corporation's operations manager, a man named Gerald, who had no idea I was the founder's daughter, approached my company seeking a software solution. Their existing systems were outdated, inefficient, and causing significant problems. Gerald had heard about our platform from a colleague and wanted to explore a partnership. I could have revealed myself. I could have refused the contract out of spite. Instead, I made a calculated decision. I instructed my team to handle all negotiations through our standard corporate channels, using the shell company structure I had established specifically to protect my identity from situations exactly like this one. The contracts were signed, the systems were implemented, and Diaz Corporation became one of our most dependent clients without ever knowing they were paying the daughter Richard had called useless. Every month, Diaz Corporation transfers $47,000 to my company for software services. Every day, their employees log into systems I designed, their order management, their inventory, tracking their entire client database. All of it runs on infrastructure I created and control. My father built his company over 40 years. I wove myself into its foundation without him ever noticing. Today, my company is valued at $86 million. A Fortune 500 corporation has been in discussions with my team for months about a potential acquisition or major investment. I have 73 employees who depend on me, clients across every industry, and a reputation in the business community that my family knows nothing about. The girl my father dismissed as lacking business sense has built something larger and more valuable than he could have imagined. But here is what matters most. Diaz Corporation cannot function without my systems. If those systems were to suddenly become unavailable, if, say, the service agreement were terminated due to non-payment or breach of contract, the entire operation would grind to a halt within days. Orders would not process, inventory would become untraceable, client information would be inaccessible. The company my father spent his life building would collapse into chaos. I had never used this leverage. For years, I told myself I was simply running a business, that my family's dependence on my systems was merely an interesting coincidence. But tonight, as I pulled into the parking garage of my apartment building and turned off the engine, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I had been waiting, preparing, building not just a company, but a weapon. And tonight, that silence would finally become my most powerful tool. I did not sleep that Christmas night. Instead, I sat at my home office desk reviewing documents and preparing for what would come next. The snow had stopped falling sometime around midnight, leaving the city blanketed in white silence. It felt appropriate, a clean slate, a fresh beginning, the world holding its breath before the storm. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, I sent an encrypted message to my chief legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been with my company for 6 years and knew every detail of our corporate structure. The message contained 3 words: Execute Protocol 7. Patricia understood immediately. Within the hour, my legal team had drafted and sent an official notice of contract termination to Diaz Corporation. The letter was professionally worded, citing specific clauses from our service agreement and documenting 3 months of repeated payment delays that violated the terms we had established. Everything was accurate, everything was legal, and everything was designed to deliver maximum impact. Diaz Corporation had 30 days to either remedy their payment issues or prepare for complete service discontinuation. Given their current financial situation, which I knew far better than they realized, remedy was unlikely. They had been struggling with cash flow for over a year, making late payments to vendors across the board while maintaining the illusion of stability. My company had been patient, extending grace periods and accepting partial payments, building a documented record of their failures. That patience was now over. The termination notice was only the first step in my carefully constructed plan. Over the following week, I assembled a team of specialists, each chosen for their specific expertise and their absolute discretion. First was Patricia herself, whose knowledge of corporate fraud law would prove invaluable. Second was Marcus Webb, a public relations expert who had managed crisis communications for 3 Fortune 500 companies and understood how to shape narratives in the media. Third was David Chen, my financial advisor, who had helped me build my company from nothing, a forensic accountant by training who could trace money through the most complex corporate structures. Finally, there was my shadow team, 4 elite programmers who had been with me since the early days, who understood my systems better than anyone alive, and who were prepared to execute technical operations that required both skill and secrecy. I trusted them completely, and they had never given me reason to doubt that trust. We met in my private conference room on December 28th, the city still quiet from the holiday season. I explained the situation without emotion, laying out the facts of my family's betrayal and the evidence I had begun to gather. When I mentioned that my father had potentially used my forged signature on legal documents years ago, Patricia's expression sharpened with professional interest. "If that's true," she said, "we're talking about serious fraud. Depending on the nature of the contracts, it could be criminal." "I want to know everything," I told her. "Every document he signed using my name, every contract I was supposedly party to without my knowledge. Build me a complete picture." David received a different assignment. I had long suspected that Diaz Corporation's financial troubles ran deeper than late vendor payments. There were rumors in the industry about questionable investments and hidden losses. I wanted those rumors investigated, every suspicious money flow traced and documented. If my father's empire was built on sand, I needed to know exactly where the foundations were weakest. Marcus would prepare for the public dimension of what was coming. When Diaz Corporation began to collapse, and I was increasingly certain it would, the media would take notice. I needed someone who could ensure that the true story was told, not the version my family would inevitably try to spin. Marcus understood the assignment and began drafting contingency communications for various scenarios. The shadow team had the most technical task, ensuring that when our systems went dark for Diaz Corporation, the transition would be complete and irreversible. No backdoors, no emergency access, no possibility of data recovery through unofficial channels. When the 30 days expired, my father's company would find itself operating blind. As my team dispersed to begin their work, I received an email that should have filled me with joy. The Fortune 500 corporation that had been courting my company for months had sent a formal partnership proposal expressing their desire to acquire a significant stake and expand our services globally. They called me a visionary in operational technology and exactly the kind of innovative leader our industry needs. I read the email twice, then closed my laptop without responding. The business world saw my value clearly. Strangers who had only known me through my work recognized what I had built and what I was capable of achieving. Yet the people who shared my blood, who had watched me grow from a child into an adult, saw nothing but failure and disappointment. I walked to the window of my office and looked out at the city below. On my desk sat a small framed photograph that I kept hidden in a drawer most days, bringing it out only when I needed to remember why I had started this journey. The photo showed a 7-year-old girl standing next to an elderly man, both of them smiling at the camera. My grandfather, my mother's father, the only person in my family who had ever made me feel valued. He used to tell me I would do great things someday. He said I had fire in me intelligence that nobody else could see because they weren't looking properly. He died when I was 10 years old, and I never learned why my mother refused to speak of him afterward, why his photographs disappeared from the house, why his memory was erased as thoroughly as if he had never existed. But I remembered. And somewhere deep inside, I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove him right. I looked at his kind eyes in the photograph and made a silent promise. I would uncover the truth about my family, all of it, including whatever secrets surrounded his death and his erasure from our history. I would expose every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal. And then, exactly 30 days later, the first system at Diaz Corporation suddenly went dark. The call came at 9:47 in the morning on January 26th, exactly 30 days after my legal team had sent the termination notice. My shadow team leader, a brilliant programmer named James, confirmed that the service discontinuation had executed flawlessly at midnight. Every system my company provided to Diaz Corporation had gone offline simultaneously exactly as planned. I thanked James and ended the call. Then I sat in silence, waiting for the chaos to begin. I did not have to wait long. By noon, industry contacts began forwarding me messages from panicked Diaz Corporation employees, posting on professional networks, desperately seeking technical help. By 3 o'clock, a business journalist I had cultivated a relationship with sent me a tip that something major was happening at Diaz headquarters. By evening, the first news article appeared online: regional business giant experiences major technical failure, operations halted. Through my network of sources and the information my forensic accountant David had gathered, I was able to piece together exactly what happened inside Diaz Corporation during those first catastrophic hours. The order management system crashed first, freezing hundreds of transactions in various stages of completion. Customers who had placed orders worth tens of thousands of dollars found themselves unable to track shipments, confirm deliveries, or receive invoices. The customer service phone lines were overwhelmed within minutes, staffed by employees who had no answers to give because they could not access any information. Then the inventory tracking went down. Warehouse managers suddenly had no idea what products were in stock, what had been shipped, or what needed to be reordered. Physical counts were attempted, but Diaz Corporation managed 17 warehouses across 5 states. Manual inventory reconciliation would take weeks, and they did not have weeks. Finally, the client database became inaccessible. Years of customer relationships, contact information, purchase histories, and communication records, all of it locked behind systems that would no longer respond. Sales representatives could not reach their accounts. Account managers could not identify their clients. The entire relationship infrastructure that Diaz Corporation had built over 4 decades was suddenly invisible. Within 48 hours, their largest client made a decision that sent shockwaves through the company. Henderson Retail, a chain of department stores that represented $12 million in annual contracts, announced they were terminating their partnership, effective immediately. The public statement cited unacceptable service disruptions and complete lack of communication as the reasons for their departure. Privately, I learned that Henderson's CEO had called Richard directly and told him that Diaz Corporation had become a liability they could no longer afford. The loss of Henderson triggered a cascade. 2 other major clients followed within the week, representing another $8 million in combined annual revenue. Smaller clients began making inquiries about contract termination clauses. Suppliers who had extended credit started demanding immediate payment. The house of cards was trembling. Inside the company, the response was exactly what I had predicted. Melissa, who had been handed the CEO title without earning a single day of the experience necessary to hold it, reacted to the crisis with the only tool she possessed: blame. 3 IT managers were fired in the first week alone. Each termination was accompanied by Melissa's public accusations of incompetence, her shrill voice echoing through the hallways as she demanded to know how they could have let this happen. The fact that the IT managers had nothing to do with the system failure, that they had merely been users of technology they did not control, never occurred to her. She needed scapegoats, and they were convenient targets. Richard was no better. According to sources inside the company, he had begun storming into executive meetings, unannounced, pounding tables, and screaming at anyone within range. His face turned purple with rage as he demanded solutions that nobody could provide. At one particularly explosive meeting, he reportedly turned on Melissa herself, shouting that perhaps he had made a mistake, entrusting her with his legacy. The united front they had presented at Christmas dinner was developing visible fractures. What my family did not understand, what they could not understand, because they had never bothered to look closely at their own operations, was that the system failure had not created their crisis. It had merely accelerated an inevitable collapse. David's forensic investigation had uncovered the truth. Diaz Corporation had been hemorrhaging money for years. 3 years ago, Richard had made a series of risky investments in overseas manufacturing ventures that failed spectacularly. Rather than admit the losses to shareholders and the board, he had concealed them through creative accounting, shifting money between subsidiaries, and delaying payments to create the illusion of solvency. The hidden debt had grown to $8 million. $8 million in losses that existed nowhere in the official financial statements, covered by a web of deception that grew more fragile with each passing quarter. The company had been surviving on reputation and momentum, but both were rapidly depleting. My system termination had not killed a healthy company. It had simply turned on the lights in a room that was already full of rot. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, tracking developments through my network of informants and public news reports. Some people might have expected me to feel satisfaction, perhaps even joy, at seeing my family's empire crumble. But as I read each new report of chaos and failure, I felt something closer to emptiness. There was no pleasure in this. My family had built their success on lies and exploitation, and now those lies were catching up to them. I had simply provided the catalyst for a reaction that had been building for years. The anger I had carried for so long was slowly being replaced by something more complex, a weary recognition that my family had always been architects of their own destruction. I had not ruined them. They had ruined themselves. I had merely stopped protecting them from the consequences. But as significant as the system failure was, it represented only the beginning of what was to come. The real secrets, the ones that would truly destroy the Diaz family name, were still buried, and they were about to be unearthed. Because that was only the first crack, the real earthquake was still coming. The first voicemail arrived at 2:14 in the morning, pulling me from a restless sleep. I looked at my phone screen, saw my father's name illuminated in the darkness, and let it ring through to voicemail. Then I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting to see if he would leave a message. He did, and then he called again, and again. By 2:47, there were 3 voicemails waiting for me. I did not listen to them immediately. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, sat in my living room, with the city lights twinkling through the window, and prepared myself for whatever my father had decided to say. I knew it would not be pleasant. I also knew it would be revealing. The first message began with a long pause, as if Richard had not expected to reach voicemail and needed a moment to collect himself. When he finally spoke, his voice contained something I had never heard before, a tremor of uncertainty. "Allison, it's your father. I know it's late, but I need to speak with you. Things have become complicated at the company, and I think we should talk. Just the 2 of us, without your mother or Melissa. Call me back when you get this." The second message came 12 minutes later, and the tremor had grown more pronounced. "Allison, it's Dad again. Listen, I know we had some disagreements at Christmas, but that's in the past now. What matters is the future of this family, of everything we've built together. I have some ideas I want to discuss with you, some opportunities that could benefit everyone. Please call me back. This is important." The third message arrived at 2:47, and by then my father's voice had crossed from uncertain into something approaching desperate. "I don't know why you're not answering. Maybe you're asleep. Maybe you're angry. I don't know. But Allison, we need to talk. The company is facing some challenges right now, temporary challenges, and I think your technical background could be useful. I'm willing to discuss bringing you back into the fold, giving you a real position this time. Not like before, something meaningful. Just call me, please. We can work this out. We're family. I listened to all 3 messages twice, analyzing every word, every pause, every shift in tone. Then I saved them to a secure backup. Evidence, documentation. Proof of the moment when Richard Diaz finally realized he might need the daughter he had discarded. What struck me most powerfully was not what my father said, but what he did not say. In 3 increasingly desperate voicemails spanning over 30 minutes of middle-of-the-night phone calls, Richard never once apologized. He never said, "I was wrong to call you useless." He never acknowledged that the Christmas dinner had been cruel and orchestrated. He never admitted that he had spent 32 years dismissing and diminishing me. Instead, he spoke as though none of that had happened. Some disagreements at Christmas, as if he had merely expressed a controversial opinion about politics rather than publicly humiliating his own daughter. That's in the past now, as if decades of emotional abuse could be swept aside because he had suddenly become inconvenienced. I recognized this pattern because I had lived it my entire life. Richard Diaz only reached out to me when he wanted something. When I was useful, I existed. When I was not useful, I was invisible. He had called me useless at Christmas because he genuinely believed it, and now he was calling me at 2 a.m. because circumstances had changed his definition of usefulness. His regret was not for hurting me. His regret was for potentially losing access to whatever help I might provide. I thought about my mother, who had sat silently while my father announced his decision, who had signed the transfer documents without hesitation. I thought about Melissa, who had mocked me as I walked out the door, confident that I would crumble without family support. None of them had reached out in the month since Christmas. No apology calls, no reconciliation attempts. Not until their world started falling apart. For 32 years, I had responded to my family's manipulation with desperate attempts to prove my worth. I had worked harder, stayed longer, given more, always hoping that if I just did enough, they would finally love me the way I needed to be loved. That Allison was gone. I picked up my phone and composed a text message to my father. I wrote and rewrote it several times, not because I was uncertain of what I wanted to say, but because I wanted every word to be perfect. Finally, I settled on a single sentence. "If you want to talk, send a formal meeting request through my assistant." I included my assistant's email address and hit send. The message was deliberately cold, intentionally professional. I was treating my father exactly the way he had treated me for decades, as someone who needed to earn access to my time and attention. I was not his daughter in this moment. I was a businesswoman who might or might not choose to take a meeting, depending on whether the request warranted consideration. According to my phone's read receipts, Richard opened that message at 3:02 in the morning. He read it. Then he read it again, and again, and again. 5 times within 10 minutes, my father stared at a 12-word text from the daughter he had called worthless, trying to comprehend how completely the power dynamic between us had shifted. He did not send a meeting request that night, or the next day, or the day after that. His pride was fighting his desperation, and for the moment, pride was winning. I went back to bed and slept more peacefully than I had in years. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail notification. I expected another message from Richard, perhaps angrier this time or more pleading. Instead, when I looked at the caller identification, I saw a name I had not heard from in over 2 years. Someone I had once trusted, someone who had worked at Diaz Corporation for 15 years before suddenly disappearing. The next voicemail was not from my father. It was from someone I never expected to hear from again. The voicemail was brief, barely 30 seconds long, but it contained enough information to make my heart pound against my ribs. "Ms. Diaz, my name is Thomas Chen. I was your father's executive assistant for 15 years before I was removed from my position. I have information you need to hear, information about your family that they never wanted you to discover. Please call me back at this number. What I have to tell you will change everything you think you know." I remembered Thomas Chen, quiet, efficient, always present in the background during my rare visits to Diaz Corporation headquarters. He had been my father's shadow for as long as I could remember, scheduling meetings, managing correspondence, handling the countless details that kept Richard's professional life running smoothly. Then about 2 years ago, he simply vanished. When I asked my mother about it during one of our infrequent phone calls, she had dismissed the question with a wave of her hand. "He left for personal reasons," she said. "Your father found someone better." Now I understood that personal reasons was a euphemism for something far more significant. I called Thomas back within the hour. He answered on the second ring, his voice careful and measured, as if he was aware that every word he spoke carried weight. "Thank you for returning my call, Ms. Diaz. I wasn't certain you would." "You said you have information about my family. What kind of information?" There was a pause on the line. When Thomas spoke again, his tone had shifted from cautious to something closer to sympathetic. "I worked for your father for 15 years. In that time, I saw and heard things that I was expected to forget. For most of my employment, I did exactly that. I kept my head down, did my job, and pretended not to notice the ugliness happening around me. But 2 years ago, I was asked to do something I couldn't ignore. When I refused, I was terminated. They called it a layoff due to restructuring. In reality, I was fired because I knew too much and could no longer be trusted to stay silent." I gripped the phone tighter. "What did they ask you to do?" "I'll get to that. But first, you need to understand the foundation. Ms. Diaz-Allison, your family has been systematically sabotaging you for over a decade. It wasn't neglect or favoritism. It was deliberate destruction." The words hit me like physical blows, even though some part of me had always suspected something like this. "Explain." Thomas took a deep breath. "When you were 24 years old, shortly after your father rejected your proposal to join the company, a series of internal reports were created. Performance evaluations, psychological assessments, competency reviews, all bearing your name, all documenting a pattern of incompetence and emotional instability. These reports were filed in company records and shared with key board members and legal advisors. I never worked at Diaz Corporation long enough to have performance evaluations," I said slowly, my mind racing. "I was there for 3 months as an intern before my father told me I wasn't suited for business." "Exactly. The reports were fabricated, every single one. I know because I was instructed to format and file them. At the time, I didn't understand the purpose. Later, I realized they were creating a paper trail documentation that could be used to justify excluding you from any future involvement in the company, and more importantly, from the family inheritance. If anyone ever questioned why Richard's eldest daughter had no stake in Diaz Corporation, these reports would provide the answer. On paper, you were incompetent, unstable, a liability." I closed my eyes, absorbing the magnitude of what Thomas was telling me. My family had not simply dismissed me. They had manufactured evidence to ensure I could never challenge my exclusion. "There's more," Thomas continued. 7 years ago, your sister Melissa was given her first major responsibility managing a contract negotiation with a national retail chain worth $15 million annually. She failed catastrophically. Her inexperience and arrogance alienated the client's representatives, and they were hours away from walking out of the deal entirely. I never heard anything about that. You wouldn't have, because your family covered it up using your work. Thomas's voice hardened slightly. Do you remember the operational analysis you did around that time, the comprehensive report on supply chain efficiency that you put together as a personal project, hoping to demonstrate your value to your father? I remembered it vividly. I had spent months on that analysis, researching industry best practices, identifying cost-saving opportunities, creating detailed implementation plans. I had presented it to my father, who had glanced at it dismissively and told me to focus on finding a real job. Your father took that analysis and presented it to the retail chain as Melissa's work, her innovative vision for operational partnership. It saved the deal. Melissa received full credit, a promotion, and a bonus. You received nothing, not even acknowledgement that your work had been stolen. The betrayal I felt was beyond anything I had words for. My own ideas, my own labor stripped away and handed to my sister like a gift. This wasn't an isolated incident, Thomas continued. Over the years, I witnessed multiple instances where Melissa's failures were concealed and Allison's contributions were appropriated. Every success your sister claimed was built on your invisible labor. You were never useless to your family, Allison. You were essential. They just made sure you never knew it. I was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. Then I asked the question that had been burning since Thomas first mentioned his termination. You said you were fired for knowing too much. What finally pushed them to remove you? 2 years ago, your mother asked me to prepare a new set of documents, legal papers, that would have permanently barred you from any claim to family assets, even in the event of your father's death. The papers included references to those fabricated performance reports, using them as justification. I refused to prepare them. I told your mother that what she was asking me to do was fraud. She smiled at me and said, "Thomas, you've always been too principled for your own good." I was escorted from the building that afternoon. My mother, I repeated slowly, not my father. This is the most important thing I need you to understand, Allison. Your father is many things arrogant, cruel, dismissive. But he is not the architect of what has been done to you. Elena is. Your mother has been directing everything from the beginning. Every fabricated report, every stolen credit, every calculated humiliation. I sat in meetings where your father raised objections, and I watched your mother override him with a few quiet words. She is the true power in your family, and she has been working against you your entire life. I felt the room tilt slightly, my understanding of my family reshaping itself around this new information. My mother, the soft-spoken woman who always deferred to my father in public, who nodded along with his pronouncements and never raised her voice. She was not passive. She was strategic, and I was her target. "I'm sending you an encrypted file," Thomas said. "It contains copies of everything the fabricated reports emails discussing the cover-up of Melissa's failure, internal memos about your exclusion from inheritance planning. I kept copies of everything because I knew someday someone would need to know the truth." "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Why now? Because I watched them destroy you for 15 years and I did nothing. I was a coward. When I heard what happened at Christmas dinner, yes, word travels in our circles, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. You deserve to know what was done to you, and you deserve the chance to fight back." Before I could respond, Thomas added one final detail, his voice dropping lower. "There's something else. Something about your grandmother, your mother's mother. Elena told everyone she died when you were 5, but that's not true. I saw correspondence between your mother and a law firm that suggested Margaret Chen was very much alive. Your mother has been hiding her from you for decades. I don't know why, but I believe your grandmother holds the key to understanding everything." I stopped breathing. My grandmother was alive. I spent the next 6 hours going through Thomas's encrypted files, my tea growing cold beside me as I clicked through document after document. Each file opened a new window into the calculated cruelty of my family, revealing layers of deception I had never imagined. But nothing prepared me for what I found buried in a subfolder labeled Legal Risk Confidential. The first document was a contract dated 8 years ago, an agreement between Diaz Corporation and an overseas manufacturing company based in Southeast Asia. The terms were aggressive, the liability clauses unusually one-sided, and the potential for legal exposure was enormous. It was exactly the kind of high-risk deal my father loved, maximum potential reward with someone else bearing the consequences if things went wrong. That someone else was me. At the bottom of the contract, on the signature line designated for authorized corporate representative, was my name, Allison Diaz. My signature, or what appeared to be my signature authorizing Diaz Corporation to enter into an agreement I had never seen, never read, never known existed. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly. Then I opened the next document, and the next, and the next. There were 7 contracts in total, spanning a 3-year period from 8 to 5 years ago. Each one involved high-risk business arrangements with questionable partners. Each one contained liability clauses that could have resulted in serious legal consequences if the deals went bad. And each one bore my forged signature as the authorizing representative. My father had not simply excluded me from the family business. He had used my identity to shield himself from legal exposure. If any of these contracts had resulted in lawsuits, regulatory investigations, or criminal charges, the paper trail would have led directly to me. I would have been the one facing prosecutors, defending myself against accusations I knew nothing about, potentially going to prison for crimes my father committed in my name. I was not just the family disappointment. I was the family scapegoat set up to take the fall, while Richard protected himself behind my forged signature. The rage that rose in me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For 32 years, I had felt hurt, disappointment, sadness, and resignation when dealing with my family. But this was different. This was a clean, bright fury that burned away every remnant of the daughter who had once desperately sought her parents' approval. They had not merely failed to love me, they had actively plotted to destroy me. The next morning, I was waiting outside Patricia Huang's office when she arrived at 8 o'clock. She took one look at my face and immediately cleared her schedule for the day. "Show me everything," she said. I handed her a flash drive containing copies of all the forged contracts, along with samples of my actual signature from legitimate documents for comparison. Patricia spent the next several hours reviewing the materials, occasionally muttering under her breath or making notes on a legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "These are definitely forgeries," she said. "I've compared them to your known signatures, and while they're professionally good, actually, there are inconsistencies that any competent handwriting analyst would identify. The slant is slightly off, the pressure patterns don't match, and there's a particular way you form your capital letters that the forger didn't quite capture." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "However," Patricia continued, "we have a significant problem. If Diaz Corporation collapses, which based on what you've told me seems increasingly likely, there will be investigations. Creditors will dig through every contract looking for assets to claim. Regulatory agencies may get involved if any of these overseas deals violated trade laws. And when they find these documents with your signature, they'll come after me," I finished. "Potentially. The forgery defense is solid, but proving it takes time and resources. You could spend years and hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting legal battles before your name is fully cleared, and in the meantime, your reputation would be destroyed. The business you've built would be tainted by association." I sat in silence, absorbing the implications. My father had created a time bomb with my name on it, and that bomb was still ticking. "What are my options?" Patricia leaned forward. "You need to get ahead of this. We should compile a comprehensive evidence package documenting the forgeries and your lack of involvement in these contracts. Witness statements, handwriting analysis, timeline documentation, showing you had no access to these deals. Then we present this proactively to relevant authorities before they come to us. It's the difference between looking like a victim who came forward and looking like a criminal who got caught." "And my father," Patricia's expression hardened. "These documents are enough to send Richard Diaz to prison. Forgery, fraud, potentially conspiracy, depending on who else was involved. If you choose to pursue criminal charges, you would have a very strong case." I thought about what that would mean. My father, 67 years old, facing prosecution and potential imprisonment. The complete destruction of not just his company, but his freedom. Part of me wanted him to feel even a fraction of the helplessness and betrayal he had inflicted on me. But another part of me hesitated. Not out of love, not anymore. Out of a desire to be different from them. To win without becoming the kind of person who would use family as weapons. "I need time to think," I said. "For now, let's focus on protecting me. Build the evidence package, prepare the proactive disclosure. I'll decide about criminal charges later." Patricia nodded, understanding. "There's something else you should know. I've been going through the corporate structure documents Thomas provided, and I found references to something that doesn't quite fit. Mentions of a separate legal matter involving inheritance and a contested will. The documents are incomplete, but it appears there was some kind of dispute about 10 years ago, shortly after your grandfather's death." My grandfather. The kind man who had told me I would do great things, whose photographs had disappeared from my parents' house, whose memory had been erased as thoroughly as my grandmother's existence. What kind of dispute? I'm not certain yet, but the fragments I found suggest there may have been multiple versions of your grandfather's will, and that the version filed with the probate court may not have been the final one he intended. I felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to shift edges, aligning in ways I had not anticipated. "Find out everything you can," I told Patricia. "Whatever secrets my family is hiding about that, will I want to know." because buried in those documents was one more secret, a secret about an inheritance that was supposed to be mine. The mention of my grandfather's will sent me spiraling back through memories I had long suppressed. But there was one memory in particular that demanded attention. Now, a memory from exactly 2 years before that Christmas dinner, a moment that had changed everything without anyone in my family realizing it. It was October 2 years ago. My mother's birthday was approaching, and despite everything, I still maintained the rituals of a dutiful daughter. I had purchased an expensive silk scarf from a boutique Elena favored, wrapped it carefully in gold paper, and driven to my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon to deliver it personally. The house appeared empty when I arrived. No cars in the driveway except my father's sedan, which he rarely drove anymore. I used my old key to let myself in, calling out a greeting that echoed unanswered through the foyer. Perhaps they were in the garden, I thought. Or perhaps my father was napping while my mother ran errands. I decided to leave the gift in my father's study, where he would be certain to find it. The study was Richard's sanctuary, a wood-paneled room lined with books he had never read, and awards he loved to display. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet, the wrapped gift tucked under my arm. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from behind the study's closed door, my father and mother speaking in hushed but intense tones. Something about their cadence made me stop. This was not casual conversation. This was something secretive, something they did not want overheard. I should have announced myself. I should have knocked on the door or called out a greeting. Instead, some instinct I did not fully understand made me press closer to the door, holding my breath, listening. My mother's voice came through, clearly sharp, with an edge I had never heard her use in public. "We need to remove her before she discovers the truth about the will. This has gone on long enough, Richard. Every day she remains connected to this family is a risk we cannot afford." "I understand, but the timing needs to be right." My father's voice was hesitant, almost deferential. "If we move too quickly, she might become suspicious. She might start asking questions." "Allison has never asked the right questions in her life," my mother replied coldly. "She's too desperate for our approval to think critically about anything we tell her. But that could change. She's getting older, more independent. If she ever decides to investigate her grandfather's estate, if she ever contacts a lawyer about her inheritance rights, she won't. She doesn't even know there's anything to investigate. And we need to keep it that way. Melissa deserves everything: the company, the assets, the legacy. Allison was always a mistake, and it's time we corrected that mistake permanently." I stood frozen in the hallway, the birthday gift suddenly heavy in my hands. My mother had just called me a mistake. Not in the heat of an argument, not as an exaggeration born from frustration, but as a cold statement of fact delivered to my father in the privacy of their home. And there was something about a will, something about my grandfather, something they were actively hiding from me. The old Allison would have burst through that door, demanding explanations through tears, desperate to understand why her own mother would speak about her with such calculated contempt. The old Allison would have made a scene, been placated with lies, and ultimately convinced herself that she had misunderstood. But something shifted in me as I stood in that hallway. Some final thread of hope that had kept me tethered to my family snapped cleanly, and in its place grew something harder and more determined. I retreated silently from the house, taking the birthday gift with me. I never delivered it. I never mentioned my visit, and I never let my family see that anything had changed. But everything had changed. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and began to plan. If my family was hiding something about my grandfather's will, I needed to understand what and why. If they were plotting to remove me, I needed to be ready. And if they thought I was too desperate and weak to ever pose a threat, I would use that assumption as my greatest weapon. Over the following months, I implemented a strategy that required patience, discipline, and absolute secrecy. I instructed my team to pursue Diaz Corporation's business more aggressively, positioning my company as an indispensable service provider. I cultivated relationships with employees at various levels of my father's organization, always casual, always friendly, never revealing my true purpose. I began documenting every financial irregularity I observed, building a file of evidence that grew thicker with each passing quarter. When Diaz Corporation's payment delays began, I did not press for immediate resolution. Instead, I allowed the delinquencies to accumulate, creating a documented pattern of contract violations that would eventually give me legal grounds to terminate our agreement on my own terms. Every email, every late notice, every ignored invoice was carefully preserved. The Christmas dinner was never a surprise attack on me. I had known for 2 years that my family intended to remove me from their lives. What I did not know was exactly when or how they would do it. So I waited, building my defenses, strengthening my position, preparing for the moment when they would finally make their move. When my father called me useless that night, when Melissa pulled out her pre-prepared legal documents, when my mother sat in satisfied silence watching her plan unfold, they believed they were executing a carefully orchestrated ambush. They had no idea they were walking into mine. The smile I showed at that Christmas table was not the forced expression of a woman trying to appear strong despite humiliation. It was the genuine smile of someone who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment. Every piece was finally in position. Every contingency had been planned. All I had needed was for my family to provide the trigger, and they had done so with theatrical cruelty. I did not survive that dinner. I orchestrated its aftermath. Every voicemail from my desperate father, every system failure at Diaz Corporation, every revelation from Thomas Chen, all of it was unfolding according to a design I had set in motion years before. My family thought they were the hunters. They never realized they had been the prey all along, walking deeper into a web I had been weaving since the day I heard my mother call me a mistake. I had anticipated media attention eventually, but the speed with which the story exploded caught even me by surprise. Marcus Webb, my PR strategist, called me at 7 a.m. with the news that the Financial Tribune had just published a front-page investigation into Diaz Corporation. Diaz Corporation faces internal mismanagement and mass exodus. Sources reveal years of hidden losses. Marcus read aloud. It's comprehensive, Allison. Someone gave them everything: employee interviews, financial analysis, internal documents. This wasn't a quick hit piece. This was months of investigative work that just happened to publish at the perfect moment. I listened as Marcus summarized the article's contents. The Tribune had documented a pattern of catastrophic leadership failures under Melissa's brief tenure as CEO. Anonymous sources described chaotic meetings, contradictory directives, and a complete absence of strategic vision. But the most damaging revelations concerned the company's finances. The article exposed years of hidden losses from failed investments, suggesting that Diaz Corporation's apparent stability had been a carefully maintained illusion. My name appeared nowhere in the piece. I was not mentioned as a source, a victim, or even a family member. But the picture it painted made clear that someone competent had once been involved in the company's operations, and that their departure had accelerated an already inevitable decline. By noon, the story had spread to every major business news outlet. Television anchors discussed the implications for regional manufacturing. Financial analysts speculated about bankruptcy timelines. Social media erupted with commentary from former employees, competitors, and industry observers. Diaz Corporation, which had enjoyed 4 decades of positive press coverage, was suddenly the center of a feeding frenzy. The stock price dropped 15% before the market closed. Then the video surfaced. I never learned who leaked it. Perhaps a disgruntled executive who had been screamed at one too many times. Perhaps a secretary who had finally had enough. Perhaps even someone on Melissa's own team seeking to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Whatever the source, the footage spread across the internet with viral velocity. The video showed a board meeting from approximately 2 weeks earlier. Richard sat at the head of a long conference table surrounded by executives whose faces had been blurred to protect their identities. Melissa sat to his right, her expression defensive. The audio quality was poor, but clear enough to understand every word. "This is a disaster," Richard shouted, his face contorted with rage. "A complete and total disaster. How could you let this happen? I gave you everything, the title, the authority, the resources, and this is what you deliver." Melissa's response was barely audible, something about circumstances beyond her control, about systems that failed without warning. Richard slammed his fist on the table so hard that water glasses trembled. Incompetent. That's what you are. Incompetent. I should have known better than to trust you with my company. Your mother said you were ready, but you're not ready. You'll never be ready. The video cut off abruptly after 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes were enough. Here was the patriarch of a respected family business screaming at his own daughter, calling her incompetent in front of subordinates, revealing the dysfunction that had been hidden behind closed doors for decades. Social media response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments poured in by the thousands expressing shock at Richard's behavior and sympathy for anyone who had to work in such a toxic environment. But what surprised me most was the direction of that sympathy. Somehow, despite my absence from the media coverage, people had begun connecting dots. Former colleagues who remembered me from my brief time at Diaz Corporation spoke anonymously about the brilliant eldest daughter who had been overlooked in favor of her less capable sister. Industry contacts shared stories about my success in the technology sector. Someone dug up old photographs of me with my family, noting my absence from recent events. By evening, a hashtag had begun trending, Justice for Allison. I sat in my apartment watching the phenomenon unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. I had not planted these stories or encouraged this public support. The momentum had built organically fueled by the natural human desire to root for an underdog against a bully, but the attention made me uncomfortable. I had never sought the spotlight. I preferred to operate in silence, achieving results without fanfare. Marcus called again. You're going to need to make a statement eventually. The press is starting to ask questions about you directly. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will. I told him I would think about it. Meanwhile, the financial consequences for Diaz Corporation accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. Investors who had loaned money to the company began demanding early repayment exercising clauses in their contracts that allowed them to recall funds if certain stability metrics were not met. Banks that had extended credit lines quietly froze those arrangements pending further review. Partners and suppliers who had done business with Diaz Corporation for decades began reconsidering their relationships. The company's assets evaporated by millions within days. What had seemed like a temporary crisis was rapidly becoming an extinction event. Then Melissa gave an interview. I watched it live, unable to look away from the slow-motion disaster unfolding on my screen. A local news channel had secured an exclusive conversation with the new CEO of Diaz Corporation, billing it as her opportunity to address the controversy and restore confidence. From the opening question, it was clear that Melissa was catastrophically unprepared. She stumbled over basic financial terminology. She contradicted herself twice within 3 minutes. When asked about the leaked video of her father's outburst, she laughed nervously and said, "All families have disagreements. It doesn't mean anything." The interviewer pressed harder. Sources say the company has been hiding significant losses for years. Can you confirm or deny these allegations? Melissa's face went pale. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed a response. Those are just rumors. We have a strong financial position. Everything is under control. Nothing about her delivery suggested that anything was under control. The interview concluded after 15 excruciating minutes, and the damage was done. Clips began circulating immediately with commentators mocking Melissa's obvious inexperience and lack of preparation. The hashtag Justice for Allison gained even more momentum, but the worst was yet to come. Because in her desperation to appear competent, Melissa made a statement that would change everything, a single sentence that revealed far more than she intended. The emergency investor conference was scheduled for the following Monday, a hastily arranged video call intended to reassure major shareholders that Diaz Corporation remained a viable investment despite the recent turbulence. I was not supposed to know about this meeting, but my network of contacts inside the company had grown extensive over the years. One of them, a mid-level manager named Sarah, who had always been kind to me during my brief internship, sent me a text message 30 minutes before the call began. "You might want to watch this," she wrote, followed by a link to a private streaming channel where the conference would be broadcast internally. I opened the link on my laptop and settled in to observe. The call began with Richard attempting to project confidence, his voice steady, as he outlined a recovery plan that sounded impressive, but contained almost no concrete details. Melissa sat beside him, her face carefully composed, nodding along with everything her father said. For the first 15 minutes, it seemed like they might actually survive the meeting without incident. Then a shareholder named Victor Reinhold unmuted his microphone. Victor was not a man who tolerated vagueness. He had built his investment firm on aggressive due diligence and brutal honesty, and he held 18% of Diaz Corporation's outstanding shares. When he spoke, everyone listened. "Richard, I've heard your plan, and I have to be direct with you. It's insufficient. The market has lost confidence in your leadership. Your systems have failed. Your CEO," he paused, glancing at Melissa, "has demonstrated publicly that she is not equipped for this role. I need to know specifically how you intend to restore operational capability within the next 30 days, or I will be forced to take action to protect my investment." Richard began a response, but Victor cut him off. "I don't want more generalities. I want specifics. Who is going to fix this?" The silence stretched for several seconds. I watched Melissa's face on the screen, seeing the pressure building behind her eyes. Her composure was cracking tiny fissures spreading across the mask she had been trained to wear since childhood. Richard cleared his throat. "We have assembled a team of consultants who specialize in consultants." Victor's voice dripped with contempt. "You're telling me you've lost your core operational systems, your stock is in free fall, and your solution is consultants. Who actually understands how this company runs? Who can step in and lead?" Melissa broke. It happened so suddenly that I almost missed it. One moment she was sitting rigidly in her chair, the next she was sobbing, tears streaming down her face as words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "Allison will come back if we ask her. She always fixes everything. She's the one who understands how things work. She's always been the one. We just need to ask her, and she'll come back and make it right like she always does." The words hung in the digital air, broadcast to every major investor in Diaz Corporation. I watched the faces on the screen cycle through shock, confusion, and dawning understanding. Melissa continued to cry, her carefully constructed facade shattered beyond repair. Victor Reinhold spoke first. "Who is Allison?" Before anyone could answer, the internet answered for them. Within minutes, clips of Melissa's breakdown were spreading across social media, accompanied by context about the eldest Diaz daughter who had been publicly humiliated at Christmas dinner and declared useless by her own father. The same father who was now sitting in stunned silence while his younger daughter admitted that the useless one had always been the competent one. The irony was not lost on anyone. I watched Richard's face transform from shock to fury. The moment the investor call ended, participants disconnecting rapidly, eager to distance themselves from the chaos. He turned on Melissa with a rage I had never witnessed. "What have you done?" He screamed, his voice loud enough that it continued to be picked up by microphones that should have been muted. "You just told the entire world that we're nothing without her. That everything we built, everything we claimed was a lie." "I didn't mean to," Melissa sobbed. "You didn't mean to. You've destroyed us. Everything your mother and I worked for, everything we planned destroyed, because you couldn't keep your mouth shut for 15 minutes. The exchange was captured by at least 3 people who had not yet disconnected from the call. Within the hour, audio clips were circulating alongside the video of Melissa's breakdown. The narrative crystallized rapidly. The Diaz family had discarded their competent daughter, elevated their incompetent one, and were now imploding under the weight of their own dysfunction. Sympathy for me grew exponentially. The hashtag Justice for Allison exploded with new momentum. Strangers who had never met me expressed outrage on my behalf, sharing stories of their own experiences with family favoritism and parental cruelty. I had become a symbol without ever asking to be one. But the most significant consequence was yet to come. Victor Reinhold, unwilling to watch his investment evaporate without a fight, exercised his rights as a major shareholder and demanded an immediate forensic audit of Diaz Corporation's finances. He hired one of the most respected accounting firms in the country and gave them unlimited access to company records. The audit began uncovering horrors within days, suspicious transactions dating back years, questionable expenses that could not be justified, evidence of financial mismanagement that went far beyond incompetence into potential fraud. Several transactions bore my mother's authorization, Elena's signature approving transfers that served no apparent business purpose. Others showed my father's name on deals that clearly violated company policy and possibly federal law. The family began turning on each other. According to sources inside the company, Richard blamed Elena for convincing him to put Melissa in charge. Elena blamed Richard for the failed investments that had destabilized the company years before. Melissa blamed both of them for thrusting her into a role she had never been prepared for. The united front that had seemed so impenetrable at Christmas dinner had crumbled into mutual recrimination. I observed all of this from a distance, feeling something I had not expected: exhaustion rather than triumph. The destruction I had set in motion was proceeding exactly as planned, but watching my family tear itself apart brought no joy. Only the grim satisfaction of seeing consequences finally catch up with people who had evaded them for far too long. Then, on a quiet Tuesday evening, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my father standing on my doorstep. He looked like he had aged a decade in the weeks since Christmas. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. When he saw me, his face crumpled. Richard Diaz, the man who had never apologized for anything in his life, stood before me with tears streaming down his cheeks. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood in my doorway looking at the man who had shaped my entire life through his rejection and contempt. Richard Diaz, the patriarch whose approval I had desperately sought for 3 decades, now stood before me as a broken supplicant. His hands trembled at his sides. His shoulders slumped forward as though carrying an invisible weight. The confident, domineering father I had known my entire life had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. "May I come in?" His voice cracked on the words. I considered saying no. I considered closing the door in his face, letting him experience just a fraction of the dismissal he had shown me for 32 years. But curiosity won over impulse. I wanted to hear what he had to say. I wanted to understand exactly how far he was willing to go. I stepped aside and gestured toward my living room. Richard walked past me slowly, his eyes scanning my apartment as though seeing it for the first time. In all the years I had lived here, neither of my parents had ever visited. They had never asked about my home, my life, or anything that mattered to me. Now my father stood in my space, surrounded by evidence of the successful life I had built without them, and I watched discomfort flicker across his features. "Nice place," he said weakly. I did not respond. I simply sat down in my armchair and waited. Richard lowered himself onto the couch across from me, his movements careful and slow, like a man who had forgotten how his own body worked. He stared at his hands for several seconds before finally meeting my eyes. "Allison, I know things have been difficult between us. I know mistakes were made, but you have to understand the company. Everything I've built over 40 years, it's falling apart. The investors are demanding answers I don't have. The banks are closing in. Melissa..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Melissa isn't capable of handling this. I thought she was ready, but I was wrong." "You thought she was ready," I repeated flatly. "Or Mother told you she was ready." Richard flinched almost imperceptibly. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" He pushed forward, ignoring my question. "The point is, we need help. The family needs help. I need you to come back, Allison. You understand operations in a way that nobody else does. You could fix this. You could save everything." I listened to his words without any emotional reaction. This was the same voice that had called me useless at Christmas dinner, the same man who had forged my signature on illegal contracts to protect himself, the same father who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless and inadequate. And now he sat in my living room, asking me to rescue him from consequences of his own making. "Why would I do that?" I asked simply. Richard blinked clearly, having expected a different response. Perhaps he had anticipated tears of gratitude that he had finally recognized my value. Perhaps he had imagined I would leap at the chance to prove myself worthy of his approval. The fact that I showed neither eagerness nor anger seemed to confuse him. "Because we're family," he said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "Allison, whatever happened in the past, we're still family." "That has to mean something." "Does it?" "Of course it does." Richard's voice took on a pleading quality I had never heard before. "Remember when you were little? Remember when I taught you to ride a bicycle in the backyard? You fell down so many times, but you kept getting back up. I was so proud of you that day." The memory surfaced unbidden. A sunny afternoon training wheels removed my father's hands, steadying the handlebars before letting go. I had been 6 years old, and it was one of the few genuinely happy memories I had of him. "I remember," I said quietly, "and the family vacations." Richard continued, sensing an opening. "Cape Cod every summer, all of us together, building sandcastles, eating ice cream, watching the sunset. Those were good times, Allison. We were happy. We can be happy again. We just need to get through this crisis, and then everything can go back to the way it was." I let his words hang in the air for a moment, examining them from every angle. He was reaching back to my childhood, searching for emotional leverage, trying to remind me of a time when I had loved him unconditionally. It was a sophisticated manipulation, the kind that might have worked on the old Allison, the one who still desperately wanted her father's love. But I was not that person anymore. "Father," I said calmly, "let me ask you a simple question." Richard straightened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. "Anything. Are you here because you love me, or because you need me?" The question landed like a physical blow. I watched my father's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like panic. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The silence between us stretched into seconds that felt like hours. "Both," he finally managed. "Of course both. You're my daughter." But his eyes told a different story. They darted away from mine, unable to maintain contact. His hands twisted in his lap. Everything about his body language screamed the truth that his words tried to hide. "That's what I thought," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not display anger or hurt or accusation. I simply acknowledged what we both knew to be true, and somehow that calm acceptance was more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. I saw it in the way Richard's face fell, in the way his shoulders curved inward, in the way his last hope of manipulating me crumbled to dust. "Allison, please. You never came to me when things were good." I continued, my voice level and controlled. "When the company was thriving, when Melissa was being celebrated, when Mother was planning her social events, you never once reached out to include me. You never invited me to dinners, never asked about my life, never showed any interest in what I had built. I only exist to you when you need something. That has been true for my entire life." Richard stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. And perhaps he was. Perhaps he had never bothered to look closely enough to see the woman I had become, someone who no longer needed his approval, no longer feared his rejection, no longer could be controlled by his conditional love. For the first time in his life, my father looked afraid of me. But I was not finished. There was one more question I needed to ask, one more truth I needed to unearth. "Father," I said, watching his face carefully, "tell me about Grandfather's will, the real one." Richard's face went completely white. The mention of my grandfather's will had struck my father like lightning, but I did not give him time to recover. While he sat frozen on my couch, his face drained of color, I stood and walked to my desk. From the top drawer, I retrieved a manila folder that I had prepared for exactly this moment. I returned to my seat and placed the folder on the coffee table between us. Then slowly and deliberately I opened it and spread the contents across the surface. 7 contracts, 7 forged signatures, 7 pieces of evidence that my father had used my identity to protect himself from legal consequences. "Explain these," I said. Richard's eyes moved across the documents, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, fear, and finally a desperate attempt at denial. He picked up one of the contracts with shaking hands, staring at the signature line, as though he could will it to disappear. "Where did you get these?" His voice was barely a whisper. "That's not relevant. What matters is that they exist and I have copies. Now explain to me why my signature appears on contracts I never saw, never read, and never agreed to sign." Richard set the paper down and attempted to compose himself. I watched the mask of the confident patriarch slide back into place, though it fit poorly over his obvious terror. "These must be forgeries," he said, his voice steadying slightly. "Someone is trying to frame me. There are people who want to see Diaz Corporation fail competitors who would do anything to destroy what I've built. They must have created these documents to turn you against your own family." I had expected this response. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed play on an audio file I had prepared. Thomas Chen's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "I personally witnessed Mr. Diaz signing these contracts using Allison's name. He practiced her signature for weeks before the first one. Mrs. Diaz provided samples of Allison's handwriting from old-school documents. They discussed it openly in front of me because they assumed I would never talk. They called it their insurance policy. If anything went wrong with these deals, Allison would be the one facing prosecution, not them." I let the recording play for 2 full minutes before stopping it. The silence that followed was absolute. "That recording has been verified by my legal team," I said calmly. "Thomas Chen has provided a sworn affidavit confirming everything he witnessed. My lawyers have also obtained handwriting analysis, proving these signatures are forgeries, skilled forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless." Richard's mask crumbled completely. The denial in his eyes gave way to naked fear as he realized that every escape route he might have imagined had just closed permanently. There was no claiming ignorance, no blaming subordinates, no hiding behind corporate bureaucracy. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. "Allison," he began, his voice cracking, "you have to understand the position I was in. The company was facing serious risks. Those contracts were necessary for our survival, but the liability exposure was enormous. I needed protection, and your mother—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. "My mother what?" I prompted. Richard's face contorted with anguish. The words seemed to cause him physical pain as they emerged. "Elena said it was the only way. She said you would never find out because you weren't smart enough to discover it. She said Melissa needed protection because Melissa was the future of the company, and you—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. But I already knew how it ended. "And I deserved to be the scapegoat," I finished for him. "Because I was useless anyway. Because if something went wrong and I went to prison, it wouldn't really matter. Because I was disposable." Richard flinched at each word, but he did not deny any of it. I had known intellectually what my parents thought of me. I had heard my mother call me a mistake through that study door 2 years ago. I had experienced a lifetime of dismissal and contempt. But hearing my father confirm out loud that they had deliberately set me up to take the fall for their crimes, that they had viewed destroying my life as an acceptable cost of protecting themselves, cut deeper than anything else. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed that the love I had spent 32 years seeking had never existed in the first place. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should never have agreed to it. I knew it was wrong, but Elena was so convincing and I was scared and You just chose your own safety over your daughter's freedom." "Yes," the word came out as a sob. "Yes, I did, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." I studied my father as he broke down in front of me. Tears streamed down his face. His body shook with the force of his guilt. A part of me, a small distant part that still remembered the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, felt something that might have been pity. But pity was not the same as forgiveness, and understanding was not the same as absolution. What Richard did not realize, too consumed by his own emotional collapse to notice, was that my phone was still active. Not playing a recording this time, but making one. Every word he had spoken since I showed him the documents, every admission, every excuse, every confirmation of the conspiracy against me was being captured and saved. This was not revenge. This was protection. If the forensic audit uncovered these contracts, if investigators came asking questions, if anyone tried to hold me responsible for deals I never authorized, I would have documented proof of my innocence. My father's own words would establish that I was a victim, not a participant. I had learned from my family after all. I had learned that documentation was power, that evidence was armor, that the only person I could truly rely on was myself. They had taught me these lessons through their betrayal, and now I was applying them with precision. Richard finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, and noticed my phone sitting on the arm of my chair. His gaze fixed on the screen on the recording timer that was still counting upward. Something in him shifted. The grief and guilt in his expression curdled into something darker. Rage, betrayal, the fury of a man who had just realized he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had always underestimated. When he understood that I had been recording his confession, something inside him snapped. Richard lunged forward and slammed his fist on my coffee table with enough force to send the documents scattering across the surface. The sound was explosive in the quiet of my apartment, a thunderclap of rage that would have made me flinch just months ago. Now I simply watched unmoved as my father's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. "You think you're so clever," he snarled, his face contorted with fury. "Recording me like some kind of criminal. After everything I've done for this family. This family exists because of me." He stood abruptly, knocking his knee against the table, but the pain didn't seem to register. He began pacing my living room like a caged animal, his voice rising with each word. "I built everything 40 years of my life sacrificed for Diaz Corporation. Every deal, every negotiation, every sleepless night that was me. And what thanks do I get my own daughter plotting against me, recording my words like I'm some kind of enemy?" I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I had learned long ago that engaging with my father's rages only fueled them. Silence was more effective, and right now silence was also more strategic. Angry people revealed things they intended to keep hidden. "You were always like this," Richard continued, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. "Always watching, always judging, always thinking you were better than everyone else. Too weak to confront anything directly, too soft to survive in the real world. Too much like your grandmother." My ears perked up at the mention of my grandmother, but I kept my expression neutral. Richard was too lost in his fury to notice the significance of what he had just said. Margaret thought she could control Elena, thought she could break up our marriage before it even started. She called me a fortune hunter, said I was only interested in the Chen family money. She tried everything to turn Elena against me, and when that didn't work, she threatened to disinherit her own daughter. Richard laughed bitterly. But Elena was smarter than her mother. Elena knew how to play the long game. She cut Margaret out, completely convinced everyone the old woman had died, erased her from our lives. And it worked. We built our empire without her interference. And he stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes wild. "Elena warned me about you from the beginning. She said you had Margaret's eyes, Margaret's stubbornness, Margaret's way of looking at people like you could see through their lies. She said if we weren't careful, you would ruin everything, just like Margaret tried to do. And she was right, wasn't she? Look at you now, sitting there with your recordings and your lawyers trying to destroy your own family." I absorbed this information without visible reaction, but inside pieces of a puzzle were clicking into place. My grandmother Margaret was alive. My mother had orchestrated her erasure from our lives, and my resemblance to this woman I had never known was apparently the root of my mother's hostility toward me. Richard's rage continued to pour out a dam that had finally broken after decades of pressure. "You want to know the truth about your precious family? Fine. Let me tell you the truth." He laughed again, the sound harsh and ugly. "Your mother has been moving money out of company accounts for months. Millions of dollars transferred to offshore accounts hidden in shell companies. She knew Diaz Corporation was going to collapse eventually. She's known for years. So she's been protecting herself, making sure she comes out of this with something." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't let it show on my face. "And the best part? She's been using Melissa's authority to authorize all of it. Every transfer, every suspicious transaction, they all bear Melissa's signature as CEO. If investigators come looking, if anyone tries to trace the money, it's Melissa who will face the consequences. Your mother set up her own daughter to take the fall just like she set you up years ago." Richard's voice cracked with something that might have been grief or might have been self-pity. I knew about it. I knew what she was doing, and I did nothing. Because that's what I do. I follow Elena's lead. I execute her plans. I pretend that I'm the one in charge while she pulls every string. Your mother controls everything, Allison. She always has. I'm just the public face, the figurehead, the fool who thought he was building an empire when really I was just building a cage for myself. He collapsed back onto the couch, suddenly exhausted, as though the rage had burned through whatever fuel had been keeping him upright. His head dropped into his hands, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing. I watched him without speaking. This was not the father I had feared as a child, the intimidating patriarch whose approval seemed perpetually out of reach. This was a broken man, a puppet who had only just begun to see his own strings. Part of me wanted to feel something sympathy, perhaps, or satisfaction, but the only emotion I could identify was a vast, quiet indifference. Richard looked up at me, searching my face for some reaction to his revelations. What he found there made him recoil slightly. "You don't care," he whispered. "None of this matters to you at all." "Should it? I'm your father." "You're a man who forged my signature on illegal contracts to protect yourself. You're a man who allowed his wife to systematically destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance. You're a man who called me useless in front of my entire family and then came crawling to me when you needed help." I paused, letting the words sink in. "You stopped being my father a long time ago. You just didn't notice because you never looked at me long enough to see." Richard stared at me as though I had become a stranger, someone he had never met before. And in a way, I suppose I had. The Allison he knew, the desperate, approval-seeking daughter who would endure any humiliation for a crumb of parental love, no longer existed. In her place sat a woman he could not control, could not manipulate, could not intimidate. I saw the exact moment he realized this. His eyes widened slightly, and something that looked almost like fear flickered across his features. For the first time in his life, Richard Diaz was afraid of his own daughter. He left my apartment without another word, stumbling out the door like a man fleeing a house fire. I watched him go, then calmly gathered the scattered documents from my coffee table and filed them away. The next morning, Diaz Corporation's stock hit rock bottom. The market had finally lost all confidence in the company's ability to survive, and shares that had once traded at $42 plummeted to less than $3. Analysts declared the company effectively worthless. Bankruptcy seemed not just likely, but imminent. But the real shock was yet to come. The collapse happened faster than even I had anticipated. Within 72 hours of my father's breakdown in my apartment, Diaz Corporation had transformed from a wounded company into a dying one. The stock price, which had already fallen dramatically, plunged to levels that made the shares essentially worthless. Trading was halted twice in a single day, as circuit breakers activated to prevent complete market chaos. I followed the developments through news alerts and reports from my network of contacts inside the company. Each update painted a picture of accelerating disaster. First came the banks. 3 major financial institutions that had extended credit lines to Diaz Corporation announced simultaneously that they were freezing all remaining access to funds. Their public statements cited unacceptable risk exposure and material concerns about management integrity. In private, according to sources who spoke to my forensic accountant David, the banks had seen early results from the shareholder-demanded audit and wanted no further association with what they had discovered. Then came the clients. Henderson Retail had been the first domino to fall weeks earlier, but now the exodus became a stampede. 3 more major clients terminated their contracts within a 48-hour window, representing nearly 40% of Diaz Corporation's annual revenue. These were companies that had done business with my father for decades, relationships built on handshakes and trust that evaporated overnight once the full scope of the dysfunction became clear. The employees followed. At first, It was a trickle senior executives updating their profiles on professional networks, quietly reaching out to headhunters taking long lunches that turned into interviews. Then, the trickle became a flood. By the end of the week, the Human Resources Department reported that over 60 employees had submitted resignations, with more expected daily. People who had once proudly listed Diaz Corporation on their resumes now wanted to distance themselves as quickly as possible. Sarah, my contact inside the company, sent me a photograph of the main office floor. The image showed rows of empty desks, abandoned coffee cups, personal items left behind by people who had walked out mid-shift. The caption she included was simple: "It's like a ghost town in here." The investigative journalists descended like vultures on a carcass. The Financial Tribune, which had broken the initial story, published a follow-up series that went deeper into the forensic audit's preliminary findings. Independent reporters from business blogs and financial podcasts conducted their own investigations, interviewing former employees, reviewing public records, connecting dots that painted an increasingly damning picture. Richard's questionable contracts were exposed in detail, including several that appeared to violate federal trade regulations. Elena's suspicious fund transfers were traced through a labyrinth of shell companies, revealing a systematic effort to extract wealth from the company while it crumbled. Melissa's series of catastrophic decisions as CEO were cataloged with brutal precision, each failure documented and analyzed. But the most damaging revelations concerned the cover-ups. Journalists uncovered evidence of fabricated reports, manipulated financial statements, and systematic deception of shareholders and regulators. The Diaz family had not simply made mistakes, they had actively concealed those mistakes through fraud and misdirection. Every newspaper, every business blog, every financial podcast seemed to be discussing the Diaz family's downfall. Commentary ranged from analytical to outraged, but the consensus was universal. This was a cautionary tale about what happened when family businesses prioritized nepotism over competence and secrecy over integrity. I watched the coverage from my apartment, feeling strangely detached from the spectacle. This was my family being dissected in public, their failures and crimes examined under a microscope. Part of me had wanted this outcome, had planned for it, worked toward it, set the conditions that made it possible. But now that it was happening, the satisfaction I had expected felt hollow. My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests and media inquiries. Reporters wanted my perspective as the estranged daughter, the overlooked sibling, the wronged family member. I declined all of them. Speaking publicly would only fuel speculation and invite scrutiny of my own role in events. Instead, I worked with Marcus Webb to prepare a different kind of statement. The transparency report was released through my company's official channels on a Thursday morning. It was a carefully crafted document that laid out my complete separation from Diaz Corporation's irregularities. The report included independent handwriting analysis proving that the signatures bearing my name on questionable contracts were forgeries. It contained timeline documentation showing I had no involvement in any of the decisions that led to the company's collapse. It referenced Thomas Chen's verified testimony about the fabricated performance reports that had been used to exclude me from the family business. But the report did more than just establish my innocence. It told a story, the story of a woman who had been systematically marginalized by her own family, whose contributions had been stolen and attributed to others, who had been set up as a scapegoat for crimes she knew nothing about. And it showed how that woman had responded not with bitterness or revenge, but by building her own success entirely on her own terms. The response from the business community exceeded anything Marcus had predicted. Industry leaders who had watched the Diaz Corporation scandal unfold with disapproval now had a hero to champion. Professional associations issued statements praising my integrity and resilience. Invitations arrived for speaking engagements at conferences focused on entrepreneurship and women in business. The Fortune 500 corporation that had been courting my company accelerated their partnership discussions, citing my demonstrated ethical leadership as a key factor in their decision. Other potential investors who had been hesitant suddenly became eager, wanting to associate themselves with someone the business press was beginning to describe as a model of professional integrity. I received hundreds of messages from strangers, women who had experienced similar treatment in their own families, professionals who had been overlooked in favor of less qualified relatives, people who saw their own stories reflected in mine. They wrote to express support, to share their experiences, to tell me that my transparency report had given them courage to confront their own situations. The hashtag Justice for Allison, which had been trending intermittently since Melissa's breakdown, exploded with new momentum. But now the conversation had shifted. People were no longer just sympathizing with a victim. They were celebrating a survivor, a self-made success story, a woman who had transformed family rejection into personal triumph. Marcus called me that evening with an update on the media landscape. "You're not just trending anymore," he said, his voice carrying a note of amazement. "You're becoming a symbol. Every major business publication wants to feature you. 3 different networks are asking about documentary rights. This is bigger than damage control, Allison. This is something else entirely." I thanked him and ended the call sitting alone in my apartment as the sun set over the city. I had wanted to protect myself, to establish my innocence, to emerge from my family's shadow with my reputation intact. I had not expected to become a public figure, but the public's reaction was even bigger than anyone expected. The collapse happened faster than even I had anticipated. Within 72 hours of my father's breakdown in my apartment, Diaz Corporation had transformed from a wounded company into a dying one. The stock price, which had already fallen dramatically, plunged to levels that made the shares essentially worthless. Trading was halted twice in a single day as circuit breakers activated to prevent complete market chaos. I followed the developments through news alerts and reports from my network of contacts inside the company. Each update painted a picture of accelerating disaster. First came the banks. 3 major financial institutions that had extended credit lines to Diaz Corporation announced simultaneously that they were freezing all remaining access to funds. Their public statements cited unacceptable risk exposure and material concerns about management integrity. In private, according to sources who spoke to my forensic accountant David, the banks had seen early results from the shareholder-demanded audit and wanted no further association with what they had discovered. Then came the clients. Henderson Retail had been the first domino to fall weeks earlier, but now the exodus became a stampede. 3 more major clients terminated their contracts within a 48-hour window, representing nearly 40% of Diaz Corporation's annual revenue. These were companies that had done business with my father for decades, relationships built on handshakes and trust that evaporated overnight once the full scope of the dysfunction became clear. The employees followed. At first, it was a trickle, senior executives updating their profiles on professional networks, quietly reaching out to headhunters, taking long lunches that turned into interviews. Then, the trickle became a flood. By the end of the week, the Human Resources Department reported that over 60 employees had submitted resignations, with more expected daily. People who had once proudly listed Diaz Corporation on their resumes now wanted to distance themselves as quickly as possible. Sarah, my contact inside the company, sent me a photograph of the main office floor. The image showed rows of empty desks, abandoned coffee cups, personal items left behind by people who had walked out mid-shift. The caption she included was simple: "It's like a ghost town in here." The investigative journalists descended like vultures on a carcass. The Financial Tribune, which had broken the initial story, published a follow-up series that went deeper into the forensic audit's preliminary findings. Independent reporters from business blogs and financial podcasts conducted their own investigations, interviewing former employees, reviewing public records, connecting dots that painted an increasingly damning picture. Richard's questionable contracts were exposed in detail, including several that appeared to violate federal trade regulations. Elena's suspicious fund transfers were traced through a labyrinth of shell companies, revealing a systematic effort to extract wealth from the company while it crumbled. Melissa's series of catastrophic decisions as CEO were cataloged with brutal precision, each failure documented and analyzed. But the most damaging revelations concerned the cover-ups. Journalists uncovered evidence of fabricated reports, manipulated financial statements, and systematic deception of shareholders and regulators. The Diaz family had not simply made mistakes, they had actively concealed those mistakes through fraud and misdirection. Every newspaper, every business blog, every financial podcast seemed to be discussing the Diaz family's downfall. Commentary ranged from analytical to outraged, but the consensus was universal. This was a cautionary tale about what happened when family businesses prioritized nepotism over competence and secrecy over integrity. I watched the coverage from my apartment, feeling strangely detached from the spectacle. This was my family being dissected in public, their failures and crimes examined under a microscope. Part of me had wanted this outcome, had planned for it, worked toward it, set the conditions that made it possible. But now that it was happening, the satisfaction I had expected felt hollow. My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests and media inquiries. Reporters wanted my perspective as the estranged daughter, the overlooked sibling, the wronged family member. I declined all of them. Speaking publicly would only fuel speculation and invite scrutiny of my own role in events. Instead, I worked with Marcus Webb to prepare a different kind of statement. The transparency report was released through my company's official channels on a Thursday morning. It was a carefully crafted document that laid out my complete separation from Diaz Corporation's irregularities. The report included independent handwriting analysis, proving that the signatures bearing my name on questionable contracts were forgeries. It contained timeline documentation showing I had no involvement in any of the decisions that led to the company's collapse. It referenced Thomas Chen's verified testimony about the fabricated performance reports that had been used to exclude me from the family business. But the report did more than just establish my innocence. It told a story, the story of a woman who had been systematically marginalized by her own family, whose contributions had been stolen and attributed to others who had been set up as a scapegoat for crimes she knew nothing about. And it showed how that woman had responded not with bitterness or revenge, but by building her own success entirely on her own terms. The response from the business community exceeded anything Marcus had predicted. Industry leaders who had watched the Diaz Corporation scandal unfold with disapproval now had a hero to champion. Professional associations issued statements praising my integrity and resilience. Invitations arrived for speaking engagements at conferences focused on entrepreneurship and women in business. The Fortune 500 corporation that had been courting my company accelerated their partnership discussions, citing my demonstrated ethical leadership as a key factor in their decision. Other potential investors who had been hesitant suddenly became eager, wanting to associate themselves with someone the business press was beginning to describe as a model of professional integrity. I received hundreds of messages from strangers, women who had experienced similar treatment in their own families, professionals who had been overlooked in favor of less qualified relatives, people who saw their own stories reflected in mine. They wrote to express support, to share their experiences, to tell me that my transparency report had given them courage to confront their own situations. The hashtag Justice for Allison, which had been trending intermittently since Melissa's breakdown, exploded with new momentum. But now the conversation had shifted. People were no longer just sympathizing with a victim. They were celebrating a survivor, a self-made success story. A woman who had transformed family rejection into personal triumph. Marcus called me that evening with an update on the media landscape. "You're not just trending anymore," he said, his voice carrying a note of amazement. "You're becoming a symbol. Every major business publication wants to feature you. 3 different networks are asking about documentary rights. This is bigger than damage control, Allison. This is something else entirely." I thanked him and ended the call sitting alone in my apartment as the sun set over the city. I had wanted to protect myself, to establish my innocence, to emerge from my family's shadow with my reputation intact. I had not expected to become a public figure, but the public's reaction was even bigger than anyone expected. Marcus eventually convinced me to accept a single interview, a carefully controlled conversation with a respected business journalist who had agreed to focus on my company's success rather than my family's failures. The segment would air on a national morning program, reaching an audience of millions. I prepared extensively, rehearsing answers to potential questions, ensuring that every word I spoke would reinforce the narrative of resilience and integrity that the transparency report had established. The interview itself went smoothly. The journalist was professional and sympathetic, asking questions that allowed me to discuss my entrepreneurial journey without dwelling on the painful family dynamics that had shaped it. I spoke about the importance of believing in yourself when others don't, about building something meaningful through persistence and hard work, about the value of integrity in business relationships. When the segment concluded, I felt cautiously satisfied that I had represented myself well. The studio was located in a downtown high-rise, and I exited through a side door to avoid the small crowd of reporters who had gathered at the main entrance. My car was waiting in a private parking area, and I walked quickly through the crisp morning air, eager to return to the quiet of my apartment. That was when I saw her. An elderly woman stood near my car, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. She was small and elegant, dressed in a tailored navy coat, her silver hair swept back from a face that seemed somehow familiar. When she saw me approaching, she straightened and stepped forward, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me stop in my tracks. "Allison," she said softly. "My dear Allison." I stared at her, my mind racing to place this stranger who spoke my name with such intimacy. Something about her features nagged at my memory. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite her obvious age. "I'm sorry," I said cautiously. "Do I know you?" The woman's eyes glistened with tears that she did not try to hide. "You did once when you were very small, before your mother told you I was dead." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Margaret Chen. I'm your grandmother." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen on the pavement, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what I was hearing. My grandmother. The woman my mother had erased from existence, whose photographs had been removed from every wall, whose memory had been forbidden in our household. She was standing before me alive, real, reaching out a weathered hand toward my arm. "I know this must be a shock," Margaret continued gently. "I've imagined this moment for 20 years, and I still don't know the right words. But when I saw your interview this morning, when I heard you speak about building something from nothing, despite everyone telling you that you couldn't, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see you. I had to tell you the truth." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "My mother said you died in a car accident when I was 5. Your mother says many things that aren't true." Margaret's expression hardened briefly before softening again. "Elena cut me out of her life 30 years ago because I opposed her marriage to Richard. I saw what he was: a charming man with no real substance, someone who would use her family's money to build his own empire while treating everyone around him as tools to be discarded. I tried to warn her, and she never forgave me for it." She stepped closer, and I could see now what had seemed familiar about her face. It was my own face, aged by decades, but unmistakably connected to mine. The same cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw, the same eyes that seemed to look through surface appearances to something deeper beneath. "I've watched you from far away for 20 years, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I hired investigators to send me reports about your life, your school achievements, your graduation, your struggles, your triumphs. I couldn't contact you directly because Elena made it clear she would destroy any relationship I tried to build. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped caring." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small photograph, holding it up for me to see. It showed a young woman in her 20s, dark-haired and determined, standing in front of a small storefront. The resemblance to my own reflection was startling. "That's me at 24, Margaret said. "I started my first business with borrowed money and sheer stubbornness. When I saw you doing the same thing 10 years ago, building your company from nothing, I knew you had inherited more than just my face. You have my spirit, Allison. That's why your mother hated you, because every time she looked at you, she saw me looking back." My mind was still reeling, struggling to absorb everything I was hearing. But one question pushed through the confusion. "The anonymous investor," I said slowly. "The one who funded my startup when nobody else would. the one who sent birthday cards signed "Someone Who Believes in You." That was you. Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I couldn't let you fail. Not when I saw how hard you were fighting, how much you deserved a chance. I set up an anonymous trust and instructed my lawyers to make the investment without revealing my identity. I wanted you to succeed on your own terms, to know that your accomplishments were truly yours. But I also wanted you to know that someone believed in you, even if you didn't know who. She reached into a bag she had been carrying and withdrew a worn cardboard box, its corners soft from years of handling. "These are letters," she said, pressing the box into my hands. 20 years of letters I wrote to you for every birthday, every holiday, every milestone I learned about from my investigators. I sent them to your parents' house, hoping Elena might relent and give them to you. She never did, but I kept copies of every single one. I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each addressed to me, in elegant handwriting, each bearing a date, spanning 2 decades of my life. I pulled one out at random, a letter dated on my 16th birthday, and unfolded the yellowed paper inside. "My dearest Allison," I read aloud, my voice breaking. "Your mother may not see your worth, but I see it. You are strong, you are intelligent, and you have a fire in you that nothing can extinguish. One day, you will prove them all wrong. Until then, know that somewhere in this world, someone loves you exactly as you are." For the first time since Christmas dinner, I cried, not from pain, not from anger, not from the accumulated grief of 32 years of rejection. I cried because I finally understood that I had never been truly alone. Margaret wrapped her arms around me, holding me as I wept on a cold sidewalk outside a television studio, and when my tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked into my eyes with an expression of fierce determination. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, "about your grandfather's will, the one that should have made you a millionaire 10 years ago." The conversation with Margaret lasted for hours. We moved from the cold sidewalk to a quiet cafe nearby, where she told me everything about her opposition to my mother's marriage, about Elena's vicious campaign to erase her from our lives, about the decades she had spent watching from a distance, unable to reach the granddaughter she loved. She promised to tell me more about my grandfather's will when we met again, but for now, she wanted me to have time to process everything I had learned. I returned to my apartment that evening, feeling as though my entire understanding of my life had been reconstructed from the ground up. The grandmother I had mourned as a child was alive. The anonymous investor who had believed in me was family after all. The isolation I had felt for 32 years had been manufactured by my mother's deliberate cruelty. I was still sitting in my darkened living room, turning these revelations over in my mind, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Melissa's name. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had nothing to say to my sister, and I doubted she had anything to say that I wanted to hear. But something made me hesitate. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps some remnant of sibling connection that had survived despite everything. I answered on the 4th ring. "Allison." Melissa's voice was barely recognizable, thick with tears, and something that sounded like exhaustion. "Please don't hang up, please." I said nothing, waiting. "I know you have no reason to talk to me. I know I've been horrible to you, but I need to tell you something, and if I don't say it now, I don't think I ever will." There was a long pause filled with the sound of ragged breathing. When Melissa spoke again, her words came out in a rush, as though she had been holding them inside for years and could no longer contain them. "5 years ago, I tried to kill myself." The statement hung in the silence between us. Whatever I had expected Melissa to say, it was not this. "I swallowed a bottle of pills," she continued, her voice cracking. "Mom's sleeping medication. I did it in my apartment alone because I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the expectations, the constant need to be perfect. Mom always told me I had to be better than you, smarter than you, more successful than you. She said if I ever showed weakness, you would win. I didn't even know what winning meant, but I was terrified of losing." I listened without interrupting my own breathing, shallow. I woke up in a hospital 2 days later. Mom was there, but she wasn't crying or scared. She was angry. She said I had almost ruined everything, that people would find out and think the family was unstable. She made the doctors sign confidentiality agreements and told everyone I was taking a wellness retreat to recover from exhaustion. Melissa laughed bitterly, the sound more like a sob. 2 months I spent in a psychiatric facility while Mom told the world I was at a spa in Arizona. When I came back, she sat me down and looked me in the eyes and said, "If you ever show weakness again, Allison wins. You are not allowed to fail." And I believed her. I've been performing ever since, pretending to be confident and capable and in control when really, I've been drowning the entire time. I thought about all the years I had envied Melissa, her ease with our parents, her seemingly effortless success, the way she moved through life as though the world had been designed for her comfort. I had never imagined that beneath that polished surface was someone as damaged as I was, perhaps more so. "I'm not telling you this to make excuses," Melissa continued. "I was cruel to you. I said terrible things, did terrible things. I let Mom use me as a weapon against you because it was easier than standing up to her. But I need you to understand, I was never really your enemy, Allison. Mom made us enemies. She set us against each other from the time we were children because she was afraid of what we could become if we worked together." The insight landed with unexpected force. Our mother had created a competition where none needed to exist, turning sisters into rivals, ensuring that we would never form an alliance that might threaten her control. Divide and conquer played out across 3 decades within our own family. "I'm not asking you to save the company," Melissa said quietly. "It's gone. I know that. And I'm not asking for money or help or anything like that. I just wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not like Dad's fake apologies, where he's just trying to get something from you. I'm sorry for every cruel word, every stolen credit, every time I stood by while Mom and Dad treated you like garbage. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to be your sister instead of your competitor." The exhaustion in her voice was profound, the weariness of someone who had been playing a role for so long that she had forgotten who she really was underneath. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I'm willing to listen. That's more than I deserve." We sat in silence for a moment, the phone connection crackling faintly between us. "I found out something today," I said slowly. "About our grandmother. She's alive, Melissa. Mom lied about her dying. She's been alive this whole time, watching us from a distance." I heard Melissa's sharp intake of breath. "Grandmother Margaret. But Mom says many things that aren't true. Apparently that's been the case our entire lives." Another long pause. When Melissa spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming more focused, despite her obvious exhaustion. "Allison, there's something else. Something I found when I was going through Mom's things last week looking for financial documents. I wasn't going to tell you because I didn't think you'd believe me, but after what you just said about Grandmother..." She took a deep breath. "I found papers in Mom's safe. Documents about Grandfather's will. His real will, not the one that was filed with the court. Allison, there were 2 versions, and the one that was supposed to be official, the one that gave everything to Mom and Dad, it wasn't the one Grandfather actually wanted." My heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" "I mean Grandfather wrote a new will 3 months before he died. One that divided everything equally between you and me. Mom and Dad hid it and filed the old version instead. Allison, you were supposed to inherit millions. They stole it from you." We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, far from the downtown areas where business journalists and curious onlookers might recognize either of our faces. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Old habits of caution asserting themselves even in this unlikely situation. When Melissa walked through the door, I almost did not recognize her. The sister I had known my entire life had been a carefully constructed image designer. Clothes, perfect, makeup, hair styled precisely, posture projecting confidence and superiority. The woman who approached my table looked like a stranger wearing Melissa's face. She was thinner than I had ever seen her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup at all, every line of exhaustion visible around her eyes. Instead of the expensive brands she had always favored, she wore simple jeans and a gray sweater that looked like it had been purchased from a department store clearance rack. She looked like someone who had stopped performing and revealed the tired person beneath the stage makeup. Melissa slid into the seat across from me, clutching a worn leather folder against her chest like a shield. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, two sisters who had spent their entire lives as rivals, finally sitting face to face without the audience that had always watched our interactions. "Thank you for coming," Melissa said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." She nodded, accepting this. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the folder on the table between us. "Before I show you what I found, I need to say something else, something I should have said years ago." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I was jealous of you my whole life, Allison. From the time we were children, I knew you were smarter than me, more capable, more real. You had something genuine inside you that I could never seem to find in myself. Everything I did was performance, good grades, because Mom demanded them, social success, because it was expected career achievements that were handed to me rather than earned. But you built things, real things. You didn't need anyone's approval to know your own worth." I listened without interrupting, surprised by the rawness of her confession. "Mom knew I was jealous," Melissa continued. "She used it. She told me constantly that if I ever admitted you were better, if I ever showed you any respect or kindness, I would lose everything. My position in the family, my inheritance, my future. She made me believe that the only way to survive was to tear you down to make sure you never rose high enough to threaten my place." Her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself. "I believed her. For 30 years I believed her, and I hate myself for it." I considered her words carefully. The jealousy she described matched the behavior I had witnessed throughout our childhood, the subtle cruelties, the stolen credit, the way she had always seemed to delight in my failures. But hearing her explain the machinery behind it, the deliberate manipulation by our mother cast everything in a different light. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I said honestly, "but I appreciate you telling me the truth." Melissa nodded, unsurprised. Then she pushed the leather folder across the table toward me. "This is what I found in Mom's safe." I opened the folder and began examining its contents. The first document was a formal last will and testament dated 3 months before my grandfather's death. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear and unmistakably his. I recognized it from birthday cards he had given me as a child, one of the few pieces of his memory I had managed to preserve. The will divided his estate equally between his 2 granddaughters, Allison and Melissa Diaz. Equal shares of his investment portfolio, equal ownership stakes in the family trust, equal inheritance of his personal property. The language was specific and unambiguous, leaving no room for interpretation. "Grandfather loved you," Melissa said softly. "Look at the notes he attached." I flipped to the next page and found a handwritten letter apparently intended to accompany the will. My grandfather's words blurred slightly as tears filled my eyes. "My dearest granddaughters," he had written, "I have watched you both grow into young women, and I am proud of each of you in different ways. Melissa, you have your mother's charm and social grace. Allison, you have your grandmother's determination and intelligence. I believe Allison will be the one to truly make this family proud, not through the wealth I leave behind, but through what she builds with her own hands. I want you both to share equally in what I have accumulated, and I hope that this inheritance will bring you closer together rather than driving you apart." I read the letter twice, unable to speak. "Mom and Dad hid this version," Melissa explained. "The lawyer who held the original died in a car accident 2 months after Grandfather passed. His files were supposed to transfer to a new firm, but somehow this will disappeared during the transition. Mom filed an older version instead, one from 3 years earlier that left everything to her and Dad with provisions for me, but nothing for you." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. My grandfather had tried to provide for me. He had recognized my worth when my parents refused to. and my mother had stolen that recognition, that inheritance, that final expression of love from beyond the grave. "The lawyer's death," I said slowly. "Was it really an accident?" Melissa's face went pale. "I don't know. I've asked myself the same question. Mom is capable of many things, but murder—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. I examined the remaining documents in the folder copies of the filed will correspondence between my parents and various legal firms' financial statements showing how my grandfather's estate had been distributed according to the fraudulent version. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. "I'm giving you these because you deserve to know the truth," Melissa said. "Whatever you decide to do with them, I'll accept. If you want to pursue legal action, I'll testify on your behalf. If you want to take back what should have been yours, I won't fight you. I benefited from Mom's lies for 10 years without understanding what she had done. The least I can do now is help make it right." I closed the folder and looked at my sister, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. "Thank you," I said simply. I now held the power to destroy everything my mother had built: her reputation, her financial security, possibly her freedom. But as I sat in that quiet cafe with evidence of decades of betrayal in my hands, I did not yet know that Elena had already made her final move. The meeting with Melissa had given me much to process, but I did not have the luxury of quiet reflection. Within hours of returning to my apartment, Marcus Webb called with urgent news that demanded immediate attention. "We have a problem," he said, his usually composed voice tight with concern. "Someone has been contacting your business partners and investors. They're spreading misinformation about you. Claims that you're mentally unstable, that you're conducting a vendetta against your family out of spite, that your business success is built on fraud and deception." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Who? The calls are coming from someone claiming to represent concerned family members. But based on the language being used and the specific details being shared, my contacts believe it's your mother. She's apparently been working the phones for days, trying to undermine your reputation before you can consolidate your position. Elena. Even as her world collapsed around her, she was still scheming, still manipulating, still trying to destroy me. "There's more," Marcus continued. "She reached out directly to the Fortune 500 company that's been negotiating with you, told them you have a history of psychological problems, that you're unstable and vindictive, that partnering with you would be a reputational disaster. She provided fabricated medical records, forgeries obviously, but convincing enough to raise concerns." I closed my eyes, absorbing the scope of my mother's counterattack. Even now, with everything falling apart, she refused to accept defeat. She would rather destroy me than allow me to succeed. What's their response? They're concerned but not convinced. I've been in contact with their communications team, providing documentation that refutes her claims. Your transparency report and the independent verification of your story are working in our favor. But this is a serious escalation, Allison. Your mother isn't just defending herself, she's actively trying to burn down everything you've built. After ending the call with Marcus, I reached out to Thomas Chen. The former executive assistant had been invaluable throughout this process, providing insider knowledge that helped me understand the full scope of my family's betrayal. Now I needed him once more. "There's something I haven't told you yet," Thomas said when I explained what Elena had been doing, "something I discovered just before I was fired but didn't fully understand until recently." I listened as Thomas revealed what he had pieced together over the past weeks. Elena had been transferring money out of Diaz Corporation for months, not the chaotic scrambling of someone reacting to crisis, but the methodical execution of a long-planned extraction strategy. She had created shell companies in offshore jurisdictions, established anonymous accounts, and built a financial escape route that would preserve her wealth even as the company burned. The transfers were authorized using Melissa's CEO credentials, Thomas explained. Every document, every wire instruction, every approval, they all bear Melissa's digital signature. If investigators examine the money trail, they'll conclude that Melissa was responsible for looting the company during its final months. My sister, the daughter Elena had supposedly favored, the one who had received everything while I received nothing. Even Melissa was just another tool in our mother's arsenal, a convenient scapegoat being prepared to take the blame for Elena's crimes. How much has she moved? Based on what I can trace, at least $4 million, probably more through channels I haven't identified. I thought about Melissa's confession about her suicide attempt and the years of performing a role she never wanted. Elena had not simply manipulated her daughters, she had systematically destroyed us both, using different methods, tailored to our individual vulnerabilities. I was rejected and excluded. Melissa was elevated and exploited. Both of us were damaged, just in different ways. The full picture finally came into focus, and it was more horrifying than I had imagined. Elena had never been the passive wife she appeared to be in public, the soft-spoken woman who deferred to her husband and supported his decisions. She was the architect of everything. The fabricated performance reports that sabotaged my reputation, the forged signatures that made me a legal scapegoat, the hidden will that stole my inheritance, the constant competition between sisters that ensured we would never unite against her. Every manipulation, every cruelty, every betrayal, they all traced back to Elena. My grandmother Margaret had tried to warn me. She had seen through Elena 30 years ago, had recognized the calculating ambition beneath the charming surface. That was why Elena had erased her so completely, not just from our lives, but from our memories. Margaret was the one person who understood what Elena truly was, and Elena could not risk her daughters ever learning that truth. I understood now why my mother had always treated me with such cold contempt. I was too much like Margaret, the same determination, the same independence, the same ability to see through deception. Elena had recognized the threat I represented from the time I was a child, and she had spent 3 decades trying to neutralize me. She had failed. I spent the next several hours in conference calls with my legal team, my PR advisors, and my forensic accountants. We reviewed the evidence, analyzed the options, and developed a strategy for responding to Elena's counterattack. Patricia Huang confirmed that the forged medical records Elena had been distributing constituted criminal defamation, adding to the already substantial legal exposure my mother faced. "You have enough to destroy her completely," Patricia said. "The fraud, the forgery, the stolen inheritance, the defamation campaign, if you pursue all of this aggressively, she could face decades in prison. At minimum, she'll lose everything she's been trying to protect." I considered this. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal case was solid. I had the power to deliver justice, or at least what the legal system called justice, and watch my mother face the consequences of her lifetime of manipulation. But as I sat alone in my apartment that night, looking at the city lights through my window, I thought about what I truly wanted. Not revenge, not destruction, not the satisfaction of watching Elena suffer as I had suffered. I wanted freedom. I wanted peace. I wanted to build a future that was not defined by my family's cruelty. So I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I executed my final move, but it was not the one anyone expected. Patricia Huang spread the documents across the conference table in her office, arranging them in careful rows like a general displaying a battle plan. The evidence we had accumulated over the past weeks was comprehensive and devastating. Forged contracts, hidden wills, financial fraud records, witness testimonies, recorded confessions. Every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, forming a picture of systematic betrayal that would shock any judge or jury. "Let me summarize what we have," Patricia said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of a lawyer who knows she holds a winning hand. "The forged signatures on those contracts constitute criminal fraud and forgery. The hidden will proves your parents deliberately stole your inheritance through document suppression. The offshore transfers demonstrate Elena has been looting the company while setting up Melissa to take the blame. Thomas Chen's testimony corroborates everything, and we have your father's recorded confession admitting to the signature scheme." She looked up at me, her expression serious. "Allison, you have them completely. One signature on these filing documents, and both your parents face criminal prosecution. Richard is looking at 5 to 10 years for the forgery charges alone. Elena could face even longer, given the scope of her financial manipulation. You could also pursue civil claims for your stolen inheritance. We're talking millions in damages plus punitive awards that could strip them of everything they have left. She slid a pen across the table toward me. This is total destruction. Their freedom, their reputation, their money, all of it gone. You've earned this. After everything they did to you, nobody would blame you for wanting them to suffer the maximum consequences. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand. The metal was cool against my fingers. All I had to do was sign, and 3 decades of injustice would be answered. My parents would face the full weight of the legal system they had used to threaten me. They would lose everything, just as they had tried to make me lose everything. I set the pen down without signing. "I need time to think," I said. Patricia nodded, unsurprised. "Take whatever time you need. But don't wait too long. If Elena gets wind of what we have, she might try to flee the jurisdiction." That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the documents spread across my coffee table. The city lights glittered through my window, indifferent to the decision weighing on my soul. I had dreamed of this moment for years, the chance to make my parents pay for what they had done, to watch them experience even a fraction of the powerlessness and pain they had inflicted on me. But now that the moment had arrived, I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache where satisfaction should have been. My mind drifted to memories I had tried to suppress. Richard, teaching me to ride a bicycle when I was 7, his hand steady on the seat as I wobbled down the driveway, his voice encouraging me to keep trying when I fell. Elena making a chocolate birthday cake when I turned 10, decorating it with pink frosting and candles that sparkled like stars. Family vacations at the beach building, sandcastles together, laughing at jokes I could no longer remember. Were those moments real? Had there ever been a time when my parents loved me genuinely, before whatever darkness in them decided I was a threat to be neutralized? Or had the manipulation been present from the very beginning, the kindness merely another form of control I would never know? The parents I had wanted, the loving father and mother who existed in my childhood memories, were either illusions I had created to survive, or people who had died somewhere along the way, replaced by the manipulators who had tried to destroy me. I asked myself the question that mattered most: if I destroy them completely, what kind of person will I be? The answer came slowly rising from somewhere deeper than thought. If I pursued maximum punishment, if I signed those papers and sent my elderly father to prison, if I watched my mother lose her freedom along with everything else, I would become someone defined by vengeance. Every success I had built, every value I had cultivated would be overshadowed by the act of destruction. I would win the battle against my parents, but I would lose something essential about myself in the process. I would become just like them. Someone who used power to harm others. Someone whose legacy was destruction rather than creation. That was not who I wanted to be. The next morning, I called Patricia with my decision. "I want them to face consequences for what they did," I said. "Release the evidence of their misconduct to the appropriate authorities. The financial fraud, the forged documents, Elena's offshore transfers, all of it. Let investigators do their work. Let the truth be known publicly. And the criminal prosecution. I won't push for maximum sentences if prosecutors decide to pursue charges based on the evidence that's their decision. But I won't be the one demanding my parents go to prison. Public disgrace and financial ruin are consequences enough." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What about the inheritance? The will proves you were cheated out of millions. I have my own money. I built my own success. I don't need what my grandfather left me, and I don't want my life to be defined by fighting over a dead man's estate. Let Melissa keep whatever remains. She's suffered enough from our mother's manipulation." "Are you certain about this, Allison? You have every legal and moral right to pursue everything." I thought about my grandmother Margaret, who had spent 20 years watching from a distance, never seeking revenge against the daughter who had erased her. I thought about my grandfather, whose final wish had been for his granddaughters to grow closer rather than fight over his legacy. "I'm certain," I said. "I want justice, not annihilation. I want to be free of them, not bound to them forever through legal battles and hatred. Winning isn't about destroying my parents. It's about becoming someone they could never be, someone who builds instead of destroys, who forgives instead of retaliates, who moves forward instead of drowning in the past. I heard Patricia exhale softly. That's a remarkably mature decision. I'll proceed according to your instructions. Within 48 hours of releasing the evidence, the Diaz family name collapsed completely, but the story was far from over. The bankruptcy filing came on a gray Tuesday morning, announced through a terse press release that contained none of the corporate optimism such documents usually attempted to project. Diaz Corporation, after 40 years of operation, was officially insolvent. The company that my father had built from nothing, that he had sacrificed his family relationships to expand, that he had used as justification for every cruelty he inflicted, it was gone. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, seeing reporters stand outside the headquarters building where I had once dreamed of working. The Diaz Corporation logo was being removed from the facade workers on scaffolding, prying away letters that had spelled out my family name for decades. Inside, according to sources who spoke to journalists, movers were carrying furniture out of executive offices, loading trucks with the physical remnants of a corporate empire. One image in particular stayed with me. A photographer had captured Richard standing in what had been his corner office, now stripped of its expensive artwork and leather furniture. He was alone, staring out the window at a view he would never see again. The man who had called me useless in that same building, who had forged my signature on contracts in that same office, who had spent 40 years believing he was invincible, he looked small and broken, a hollow shell of the patriarch he had once pretended to be. The irony was not lost on the commentators who discussed the image on business news programs. They noted that Richard had publicly dismissed his eldest daughter as incompetent, only to have his company collapse while her business thrived. They observed that the man who had prided himself on his business acumen had been outmaneuvered by the child he had discarded. The narrative wrote itself, and it was not kind to my father. The legal consequences followed swiftly. Investigators had been examining the evidence I released, and within weeks, formal charges were filed against both my parents. Richard faced prosecution for fraud and forgery related to the contracts bearing my forged signature. The evidence was overwhelming: his own recorded confession, the handwriting analysis, Thomas Chen's testimony. There was no defense that could save him. Given his age and the fact that I had declined to pursue maximum penalties, the judge showed a degree of mercy that Richard had never shown anyone else. He received a suspended sentence of 3 years, meaning he would avoid prison as long as he committed no further offenses. But the financial penalties were severe fines that consumed most of his remaining personal assets, restitution payments that would continue for years. Additionally, he was banned from serving as an officer or director of any company for 10 years, effectively ending his business career forever. Elena's situation was even more precarious. The investigation into her offshore transfers and asset concealment revealed a systematic pattern of fraud that shocked even prosecutors who thought they had seen everything. She had been looting Diaz Corporation for months, funneling money into hidden accounts while preparing to let the company collapse. The documentation showing she had used Melissa's authority without her knowledge added another layer of betrayal to an already damning case. Like Richard, Elena received a suspended sentence. The prosecutors acknowledged that Allison Diaz had requested leniency, and the judge took this into consideration. But she lost almost everything. The offshore accounts were frozen and eventually seized. Her personal assets were liquidated to pay fines and restitution. The woman who had spent 30 years building a facade of wealth and social prestige was left with almost nothing. Her reputation destroyed, her schemes exposed for the world to see. They avoided prison as I had intended, but they lost everything else: their money, their status, their company, their social standing, and most importantly, the power they had used to control and manipulate others. The punishment fit the crimes, at least in my judgment. They would spend their remaining years living with the consequences of their choices, unable to escape the public knowledge of what they had done. But while my parents faced their reckoning, I focused my attention on the innocent people who had been caught in the collapse. Diaz Corporation had employed over 200 people at its peak. These were hard-working individuals who had nothing to do with my family's schemes: administrative assistants, warehouse workers, sales representatives, accountants, who had simply done their jobs without knowing the corruption that existed at the top. When the company collapsed, they all lost their livelihoods through no fault of their own. I could not save the company, and I would not have wanted to, even if I could. But I could help the people who had been harmed by its destruction. I reached out to my industry contacts, calling in favors I had accumulated over a decade of building relationships. I asked business owners and hiring managers to consider former Diaz Corporation employees, vouching for the competence and character of people I had come to know through my network of informants inside the company. Sarah, who had sent me updates throughout the crisis, received a glowing recommendation that helped her land a position at a growing logistics firm. Others found similar opportunities through connections I facilitated. For those whose skills aligned with my own company's needs, I went further. I created new positions, expanded teams, and personally interviewed candidates who had been displaced by the bankruptcy. By the time the process was complete, I had hired 14 former Diaz Corporation employees, giving them stable jobs with competitive salaries and the opportunity to rebuild their careers. The business press noticed. Articles appeared praising my integrity and compassion during the crisis, contrasting my behavior with the selfishness my parents had demonstrated. Industry leaders cited me as an example of ethical leadership, someone who used success to help others rather than exploit them. The Fortune 500 partnership that had been endangered by Elena's defamation campaign was finalized with executives specifically mentioning my character as a factor in their decision. I did not seek this recognition, but I did not reject it either. For too long, my family's narrative had defined me as worthless and incompetent. Now a different story was being told, one where I was the hero rather than the villain, the builder rather than the destroyer. 6 months passed. The bankruptcy proceedings concluded. My parents disappeared from public view, living in reduced circumstances, somewhere I did not care to know. My company continued to grow, my reputation continued to strengthen, and my life continued to move forward. I thought the worst was over. I thought I could finally begin to heal. But the past was not finished with me yet. The house sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, its weathered shingles and wide windows perfectly suited to the rugged coastline. I found it on a quiet afternoon in early spring, driving along the coastal highway with no particular destination in mind. The for sale sign was half hidden by overgrown roses, and the property had been on the market for months because most buyers wanted something newer, more modern, less in need of care. I saw something different. I saw the home I had dreamed about since childhood, when I would flip through magazines and imagine living somewhere beautiful and peaceful, far from the tensions of the Diaz household. I saw morning light streaming through salt-sprayed windows, evenings spent watching the sun sink into the water, nights falling asleep to the rhythm of waves against rocks. I made an offer that same day, and 6 weeks later I moved in. The first morning I woke in that house, I lay in bed for nearly an hour, simply listening to the ocean. No alarm demanding I rise for work that would never satisfy my family. No anxiety about what criticism awaited me at the next holiday gathering. No mental rehearsal of how to make myself smaller, quieter, less threatening to people who should have celebrated my existence. Just waves, just wind, just the cry of seabirds wheeling over the water. I established new routines in the weeks that followed, small rituals that marked my liberation from the life I had left behind. Each morning, I walked along the beach as the sun rose, feeling cold sand between my toes and salt spray against my face. I learned to cook meals I actually enjoyed rather than dishes designed to impress parents who would never be impressed. I read books for pleasure, losing myself in stories without the guilt that had always accompanied any activity not directly productive. In the evenings, I sat on my deck and watched the sunset, practicing meditation techniques I had learned from an app on my phone. The practice had seemed frivolous when I first tried it years ago. What successful businesswoman had time to sit and breathe? But now I understood its value. Each session helped quiet the critical voice in my head, the one that sounded like my father telling me I would never be enough. These simple pleasures had been impossible when I lived under my family's shadow. Every moment had been colored by the need to prove myself to earn approval that would never come to defend against attacks that could arrive without warning. I had survived, but I had not lived. Now, for the first time in 32 years, I experienced what it meant to exist without fear, without obligation, without the exhausting performance of being a Diaz daughter. The speaking invitations began arriving a few months after I settled into my new home. Women's business conferences, leadership summits, entrepreneurship workshops, organizations across the country wanted to hear my story. At first, I declined them all, uncomfortable with the idea of discussing my family's dysfunction in public forums. But Marcus Webb, who had remained my trusted advisor, encouraged me to reconsider. "Your story isn't just about revenge or family drama," he said during one of our calls. "It's about resilience. It's about building something from nothing when everyone tells you that you can't. There are women out there who need to hear that message." I accepted my first speaking engagement at a women's leadership conference in Chicago. The audience was primarily professionals over 40, many of them executives who had fought their own battles against dismissal and discrimination. As I stood at the podium and shared my journey from overlooked daughter to discarded family member to self-made success, I watched faces in the crowd shift from curiosity to recognition to something that looked almost like hope. Afterward, dozens of women approached me with their own stories. Mothers who had been told by their families that they were too ambitious. Daughters who had been passed over for less qualified brothers. Wives who had rebuilt their lives after discovering their worth was never recognized at home. They thanked me for speaking openly, for showing that escape and success were possible, for proving that family rejection did not have to define a person's future. I left that conference understanding something I had not fully grasped before. My story was not unique. Millions of women had experienced variations of the same dismissal, the same exploitation, the same systematic undermining of their confidence and capabilities. By sharing what I had overcome, I could offer something more valuable than business advice. I could offer proof that survival was possible. The speaking engagements multiplied after Chicago. I traveled to conferences across the country, refining my message with each presentation. I became known not as a revenge story, but as a story of resilience, self-worth, and the courage to define your own path. The women who heard me speak often wrote afterward to share how my words had inspired them to make changes in their own lives, leaving toxic relationships, starting businesses demanding recognition they had been denied. Through it all, Margaret remained a constant presence. My grandmother visited my ocean house regularly, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. We spent hours on the deck talking, sharing stories, rebuilding the relationship that my mother had stolen from us decades ago. Margaret told me about her own life, how she had started a small import business after her husband abandoned her with 2 young children, how she had built it into a successful enterprise through sheer determination, how Elena had grown to resent her mother's independence rather than admire it. "Your mother wanted to be taken care of," Margaret explained one evening as we watched the sun set. She saw my self-reliance as a burden rather than a gift. When Richard came along with his charm and his promises of wealth, she chose dependence over freedom. And she spent her whole life punishing anyone who reminded her of the choice she made. I began to understand that my strength had not emerged from nowhere. It was inherited from this remarkable woman, passed down through genes and example, even though we had been kept apart. The determination that had allowed me to build my company, the resilience that had helped me survive my family's cruelty, these were Margaret's gifts to me, delivered across decades of separation. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. I had a home I loved, work that fulfilled me, a grandmother who cherished me, and a future that belonged entirely to myself. Until one morning I found a handwritten letter in my mailbox, and everything changed again. The envelope bore no return address, only my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. Melissa's careful script, the same penmanship she had perfected in childhood, when our mother insisted that elegant handwriting was a mark of good breeding. I stood at my mailbox for a long moment, holding the envelope as the ocean wind tugged at my hair, uncertain whether I wanted to read whatever was inside. I carried it back to my house and set it on the kitchen counter, where it sat unopened for the rest of the day. I made breakfast, answered emails, took my morning walk along the beach. But my eyes kept returning to that envelope, that familiar handwriting, that unexpected intrusion from a past I had worked so hard to leave behind. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair on the deck. I opened the envelope, carefully extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery covered in dense handwriting. "Dear Allison," the letter began. "I've started this letter dozens of times over the past 6 months, and each time I've thrown it away because the words felt inadequate. They still feel inadequate. But I've learned in therapy that waiting for perfect words is just another way of avoiding difficult truths. So I'm sending this version imperfect as it is because you deserve to hear what I have to say." I read on my wine, untouched, beside me. Melissa wrote about her journey since the collapse. She had checked herself into a treatment facility shortly after our parents received their sentences, finally seeking help for the depression and anxiety she had hidden for years. The therapy had been grueling, forcing her to confront not only her own failures, but the family dynamics that had shaped her into someone she no longer wanted to be. "I spent my whole life trying to be what Mom wanted," she wrote. "The perfect daughter, the successful heir, the winner in a competition I never asked to enter. I thought if I could just achieve enough, be enough, she would finally love me without conditions. But there were always more conditions. There was always another way I was falling short. And the only way she knew to motivate me was to hold you up as the threat, the sister who would take everything if I ever showed weakness." She described her volunteer work at a shelter for domestic abuse survivors, a choice that had surprised everyone who knew her. "I never thought of myself as someone who experienced abuse," Melissa continued. "We lived in a beautiful house where expensive clothes went to the best schools, but abuse isn't always physical. Mom abused both of us, me through impossible expectations and constant fear, you through rejection and sabotage. I'm only now beginning to understand how deeply that damage runs." The letter continued for 3 more pages, detailing realizations that had emerged through months of intensive work with therapists and counselors. Melissa wrote about learning to live without Elena's constant direction, about discovering that she had no idea who she actually was beneath the performance she had maintained for 30 years. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she concluded. "I'm not asking for anything. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't pretend that a letter can undo decades of cruelty. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what Mom did to both of us, and I'm sorry I was too blind or too scared to see it when it mattered. I'm sorry for every cruel word, every stolen credit, every time I stood by and let them hurt you. I'm sorry for being the weapon they used against you instead of the sister you deserved." I set the letter down and stared at the ocean until the sun disappeared completely. 1 week later, a second envelope arrived. This one bore a return address I did not recognize, an apartment complex in a modest neighborhood far from the affluent areas where my parents had always lived. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, the letters uneven, clearly written by a hand that trembled. My father's hand. I opened this letter immediately, my heart pounding despite my attempts at emotional detachment. "Dear Allison," Richard had written. The words were simple, without the elaborate justifications or deflections I had expected. "I have written and rewritten this letter many times. Each version tried to explain why I did what I did to provide context that might make my actions understandable. But explanations are just excuses wearing better clothes, and you deserve better than excuses." The letter was short, barely a single page, but each sentence carried weight. "I was your father and I failed you. Not just at Christmas, though that night haunts me more than you can know. I failed you for your entire life. I let your mother convince me that you were a threat instead of seeing you were a gift. I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting the business, protecting Melissa. But I was really just protecting myself from having to stand up to Elena, from having to admit that I had married a woman whose ambition had no room for love." Richard wrote about his current circumstances without self-pity. The small apartment, the limited income from what remained after fines and restitution, the long days with nothing to do but reflect on decisions he could never undo. I am old now, and I have nothing left. Not money, not status, not the respect I spent 40 years trying to earn, but losing everything has given me clarity I wish I had possessed decades ago. I see now what I refused to see then, that you were always the strong one, the capable one, the one who would have made me proud if I had let myself feel pride instead of fear. The final paragraph made my breath catch in my throat. I needed you to know that I see my mistakes, all of them, and more importantly, I see you. I see the woman you became despite everything I did to diminish you. I see the success you built without any help from the family that should have supported you. I see the grace you showed in not destroying me completely when you had every right and every ability to do so. I'm sorry, Allison. Those words are inadequate, but they are all I have left to give. I'm sorry. I read both letters multiple times over the following days, sitting with them during my morning beach walks, returning to them during quiet evenings on my deck. I analyzed every sentence, searching for hidden manipulations, waiting for the familiar feeling of being played that had accompanied every interaction with my family for as long as I could remember. But I found nothing false. Melissa's letter showed genuine insight and accountability. Richard's letter contained no attempts to shift blame or minimize his actions. For the first time in their lives, my sister and father seemed to be offering something real. I expected to feel overwhelming emotion joy at finally receiving the acknowledgement I had craved, or fury that it had taken the destruction of everything for them to see the truth. Instead, I felt something quieter, more complex. The letters did not heal the wounds of 32 years. They could not undo the forged signatures, the stolen inheritance, the public humiliation, the lifetime of dismissal. Too much had happened for simple words on paper to make everything right, but I also did not feel the cold anger that had sustained me through the darkest months of confrontation and collapse. That anger had served its purpose, protecting me when I needed protection, fueling me when I needed strength. Now it felt like armor I no longer required. I thought about what Margaret had told me during one of her visits. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying their offenses. She had forgiven Elena decades ago, not because Elena deserved it, but because Margaret refused to spend her life poisoned by resentment. Forgiveness, I realized, was not about excusing what my family had done. It was about refusing to let their actions control my future. It was about choosing freedom over bondage, peace over perpetual war. I sat down at my desk and began to write responses. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as I found clarity about what I wanted to say. But even as I wrote, I knew that responding to letters was not the same as rebuilding relationships. I still had a choice to make, one that would define the rest of my life. The afternoon was unseasonably warm, and I walked along the beach longer than usual, letting the rhythm of the waves guide my thoughts. The letters from Melissa and Richard sat on my desk at home, their responses still unwritten. I had been avoiding this task for days, uncertain what I wanted to say, uncertain what I wanted at all. My therapist, a woman I had begun seeing shortly after moving to the coast, had helped me understand something crucial during our last session. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation. I could release the anger, let go of the resentment, free myself from the burden of carrying their offenses, all without opening the door to being hurt again. The two processes were separate, and I had the power to choose one without the other. But what did I actually want? I stopped walking and stood at the water's edge, letting cold foam wash over my feet. The Christmas dinner felt like it had happened in another lifetime to another person. The woman who had sat at that table absorbing her father's cruelty with practiced silence no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had built a life worth living, someone who no longer needed approval from people who had never deserved the power to grant or withhold it. Did I want my family back? The honest answer was complicated. I wanted the family I had never actually had, loving parents, a supportive sister, holiday gatherings filled with genuine warmth. But that family was a fantasy. The real Diaz family had been toxic from the beginning, poisoned by Elena's manipulation and Richard's weakness. What I could have potentially were relationships with the people my sister and father were becoming. Melissa working through her trauma in therapy, volunteering with abuse survivors, learning to exist outside Elena's shadow, Richard stripped of everything, finally confronting the cowardice that had defined his life. Were those relationships worth pursuing? Were they worth the risk? I returned home as the sun began to set and sat down at my desk. The time for avoidance had passed. Whatever I decided, I needed to decide it clearly and communicate it honestly. I wrote to Melissa first. "Dear Melissa," I began, "I received your letter and I want you to know that I believe every word. I can see how hard you've worked to understand what happened to both of us, and I'm proud of the person you're becoming. I forgive you, not because what happened doesn't matter, but because holding on to anger only hurts me, and I'm done being hurt by our family." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But I cannot be your sister the way we were before. Too much has happened, too many wounds that haven't fully healed. I want you to succeed and find peace, but I need to protect my own peace too. Perhaps in time we can build something new, but it will be different from what we had, and it will be slow. I hope you understand." The letter to Richard was shorter. I found I had less to say to him, perhaps because I expected less from him than I had ever expected from my sister. "Dear Richard," I wrote, "I received your letter. I believe your regret is real, and I'm grateful you finally found the courage to see the truth. But I cannot have you in my life, not because I hate you, but because being around you brings back pain I've worked too hard to overcome. I hope you find peace in whatever time you have left, but that journey is yours, not mine. I wish you well." For Elena, I wrote nothing at all. Some bridges were not meant to be rebuilt. My mother had orchestrated decades of cruelty, had viewed me as a threat from childhood, had stolen my inheritance, and my grandmother, and my relationship with my sister. She had never written to apologize because she was not sorry, and I would not waste words on someone who would not hear them. I sealed both letters and addressed the envelopes. As I placed stamps in the corner of each one, I felt something release from my chest, a tightness I had carried so long I had forgotten it was there. The weight of 32 years of hoping, resenting, grieving, raging, it lifted, dispersing like morning fog under warm sun. I was free, finally, completely free. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, someone knocked on my door. The knock came just as the sun was setting, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. I was not expecting visitors. Margaret had called earlier to say she would arrive tomorrow morning, so I approached the door with curiosity rather than anticipation. Melissa stood on my porch, snowflakes, dusting her dark hair. She looked different from the last time I had seen her more than a year ago at that quiet cafe where she had handed me the evidence of our parents' betrayal. The gauntness that had marked her face then had softened into something healthier. Her eyes were clear, her posture relaxed, her smile genuine in a way I had never seen from her before. "I hope it's okay that I came," she said quietly. "I know your letter said things would be slow, but it's Christmas Eve and I wanted to see you." I studied my sister for a long moment, searching for any trace of the calculating competitor I had known my entire life. I found none. The woman standing before me was someone new, someone forged in the same fires that had transformed me. "Come inside," I said, stepping back to let her enter. We sat by the large window that overlooked the ocean, watching snow fall over the water in the fading light. Melissa held a cup of tea between her hands, her gaze distant but peaceful. "Your letter changed my life," she said finally. "I read it so many times that I memorized every word. Knowing that you forgave me, even with boundaries, gave me permission to forgive myself. I had been carrying so much guilt, so much shame. Your letter helped me let it go." She told me about her work at the shelter for abused women, how she had started as a volunteer and gradually taken on more responsibility. She was helping other survivors navigate the legal system, using the organizational skills she had developed in business school for something that actually mattered. "I finally feel like I'm becoming someone worth being," she said. "Not mom's perfect daughter, not the family success story, just someone who helps people who need help." We talked for hours as darkness fell outside and Christmas lights began twinkling along the coastline. We spoke like two people who had survived a war together, not with the old jealousy and competition that had poisoned our relationship for decades, but with hard-earned understanding. We acknowledged the pain without dwelling in it. We recognized our shared history without letting it define our future. Before Melissa rose to leave, I walked to my desk and retrieved an envelope I had prepared weeks ago, uncertain whether I would ever have the opportunity to deliver it. "This is for you," I said, pressing it into her hands. Melissa opened the envelope and examined the documents inside. Her face cycled through confusion, then shock, then disbelief. "Allison, this is 5% of your company. Approximately $4 million at current valuation," I confirmed. "And this isn't because you're family. It's because you had the courage to change. Use it to keep helping others. Expand the shelter's programs. Start something new. Whatever feels right." I paused, meeting her eyes steadily. "Don't make me regret this." Melissa embraced me, her arms tight around my shoulders, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. We held each other for a long moment, two sisters who had been enemies, who had been strangers, who were now something new and undefined but genuine. After Melissa drove away into the snowy night, I stood at my window watching her taillights disappear. Margaret appeared beside me, having arrived earlier than planned to spend Christmas Eve together. She slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm and steady. "You did what I never could," she said softly, her eyes on the darkness where Melissa's car had vanished. "You forgave and you let go." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "I learned from your letters, Grandma. 20 years of them." The Christmas lights twinkled along the coastline, peaceful and bright. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from that Christmas table of lies to this Christmas of truth. From a daughter desperate for approval to a woman who needed nothing from anyone. From a family built on manipulation to relationships built on honesty. I was not defined by my family's cruelty. I was defined by who I chose to become despite it. That night, under the quiet glow of the Christmas lights, I did not just feel free, I felt whole. Not because I had won, but because I had become someone truly worth being. Allison's story reminds us that our worth is never determined by those who fail to see it. She spent 32 years believing she was useless because the people who should have loved her most told her so. But the truth was always there, waiting to be discovered. If someone in your life has ever made you feel small, unworthy, or invisible, I want you to know this. Their blindness is not your reality. You have the power to build something beautiful, something meaningful, something entirely your own. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. If Allison's story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Did you prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Until next time, remember, you are enough exactly as you are.